Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. Alright, buckle up, because this story is wild. I had to share it. Had to get it out of my system after being forced to listen to it over New Year's Eve dinner. It's about my grandpa, Charlie. He's a character. We were all gathered around, trying to enjoy some holiday ham, when he just launches into this thing. Some of you are probably thinking, my stomach's made of steel, I can handle it. Maybe you'll see. So, picture this: Vietnam, the late 60s. Charlie, who wasn't much older than I am now, gets drafted. Now my grandpa, even back then, was a little guy. Short, skinny, built like a stiff breeze could knock him over. This, believe it or not, made him perfect for the most messed up job imaginable, a tunnel rat. These were the guys who had to crawl through the Viet Cong's underground tunnels. And these weren't just any tunnels. These were claustrophobia-inducing, dirt-walled nightmares. We're talking narrow. Like you couldn't turn around, couldn't even stretch your arms out. And that's where they sent my Gramps. He had to go down into the earth, into these tunnels that were used to move troops, store weapons, and set up all those nasty booby traps. You know, the Viet Cong liked ambushes. Gramps' job, along with his squad, was to find these guys hiding in their tunnels and shoot them. The pic I shared earlier gives you a little glimpse into what these tunnels were like. Imagine being in there. I can't. Anyway, one day Charlie's down there, doing his thing, when all hell breaks loose. He's with two other guys, up at the entrance of the tunnel, when they get ambushed. Boom, boom, boom. They're down. Charlie's maybe 20 feet into the tunnel and a few feet underground. He hears the shots, but he can't see a damn thing. He has no idea who attacked them, or if anyone else is even alive. Turns out he's the only one left. He's frozen, terrified. He figures whoever took out his buddies is gonna start chucking grenades down the hole, and that'll be it for him. But nothing happens. Minutes tick by, and he starts to breathe a little easier. Okay, maybe he's in the clear. He starts inching forward again. Then, it starts to rain. Now, a little rain might not sound like a big deal, but in an unfinished tunnel like that, it's basically a death sentence. The whole thing can collapse, bury you alive. Charlie had heard the stories from his squad mates, guys who'd lost friends down in those tunnels, lost them forever. He's thinking, this is it. I'm gonna be one of those stories. But, in true Charlie fashion, he's not going down without a fight. He starts crawling again. He's got a pistol and a Fulton flashlight. The angled kind that clips onto your gear. The plan had been simple: sneak through the tunnel, find a bigger chamber where some VC were supposedly hiding, surprise them, shoot them, and get the hell out. That's how his first 3 tunnel missions had gone. This one, his fourth, was already a disaster, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. As he crawls, the tunnel gets even narrower. He hears water rushing ahead, and for a second, he thinks maybe it's the main chamber. Nope. It's the ground above him, turning to mud and sloshing down, sealing off the tunnel ahead. This is the moment. he told us, when he really started to freak. He wasn't that deep underground, but he knew if he didn't start clawing his way up, and fast, he was a dead man. So, he claws, like an animal. His fingernails tear off, his hands get shredded, but he manages to get part of his arm and his face out of the mud. It's not much, but it was enough to keep breathing. He's alive for now. So, there's Charlie, clawing his way out of a muddy grave, only to find himself in a whole new kind of hell. He's stuck. Really stuck. His lower back is jammed against the tunnel wall, and the angle has him bent into this weird, elongated U shape. His legs are pinned down. Above him, he can see a little patch of daylight, maybe a square foot, through the hole he clawed open. Freedom is right there, but he can't reach it. He knows that if it starts raining hard again, he'll drown, but the rain holds off, for now. Instead, the insects arrive. First up, ants. Thankfully, not the giant red nightmare ants everyone in Nam was terrified of. The ones with a bite that felt like getting shot. These were tiny black ants, but there were a lot of them. Charlie figured the flooding had driven them out of their nest. Now they were crawling all over him, his scalp, his face, his neck. They didn't bite, but they tickled and itched like crazy. Any that crawled onto his lips, he licked off and swallowed. Figured he might be there a while, might need the protein. After a while, the ants moved on. Then came the flies. Now, to understand why this was a special kind of torture, you gotta picture how Charlie was positioned. Remember, he's twisted up like a pretzel. One arm is stretched out in front of him, but his shoulder and upper back are totally immobile. He can move his upper arm, wrist, and hand a little, but anything below the elbow is basically useless. So, what's the problem? His armpit is exposed. Just barely, maybe an inch of clearance, but that's more than enough for the flies. And let me tell you, those flies were loving his warm, sweaty pit. Over the next hour or so, 20, maybe 30 fat, brownish, black flies take turns diving into his armpit. They'd hang out for a bit, usually no more than 6 or 7 at a time, then buzz off. And yeah, while they were in there, they were biting. Charlie said the pain was sharp and awful, like the deep, throbbing itch of a horsefly bite. And there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He just had to grit his teeth and bear it. As the sun started to go down, most of the flies lost interest and left. He could still feel a few nestled in his armpit hair, but the majority were gone. Now, it was just the mosquitoes, with their endless buzzing and biting. Somehow, through all of this, Charlie managed to fall asleep. He woke up to a new day and a new horror. He'd seen some crazy giant bugs in Vietnam, but he'd managed to avoid the one that really freaked him out. The giant centipedes. These things were as long as a man's forearm and as thick as a beer bottle. One of his more sadistic squad mates had hidden one in another guy's bunk as a prank. The poor guy got bitten 10 times on his feet and toes before he could even scramble out of bed. Charlie hated even the tiny centipedes back home, so the thought of these monsters made his blood run cold. And then, 5 minutes after he opens his eyes, what does he see? One of those goddamn centipedes, crawling onto his hand and wrapping itself around his wrist. He's too terrified to move. He could maybe flick his wrist a little, try to shake it off, but he's not taking any chances. So he waits. And this centipede, it's like it's taunting him. It just stays there for over an hour until Charlie can't take the stress anymore. He decides to try to grab the thing in his fist. The moment he moves, it starts biting. Charlie manages to get a grip on it and squeezes with all his might. The centipede breaks in half, sending disgusting goo down his arm. The two pieces fall into the hole. The front part is still alive, and as it's dying, it bites him on the nose and lips. He has to grab its head in his teeth and, well, you get the picture. He told us what it tasted like, but I'm gonna spare you that detail. Just know it was as bad as you're imagining. The rest of the day is a blur of pain and disgust. Flies swarm the dead centipede, eating, shitting, and making more flies all over it. The centipede juice on his arm, which had dribbled all the way down into his armpit, was apparently like fly ambrosia. More and more of them were going in and out of his pit. He could feel them in there, crawling around. The itching and pinching was almost worse than the throbbing centipede bites, which were now swollen and nasty. Then, to top it all off, it started to rain again. The rain was a mixed blessing. On one hand, most of the bugs scattered, seeking higher ground. On the other hand, Charlie was pretty sure he was about to drown. He fully expected the hole to fill with water, and that would be the end of his story. But it didn't, and he didn't. He even managed to catch some of the rainwater in his mouth. He hadn't had any real food or water in over 24 hours at that point. So those few drops were like a gift from the gods. Then there was a terrifying moment when the dirt under his hips shifted. He felt himself drop a little, and he thought the whole tunnel was about to collapse on him, burying him for good. Again, he got lucky. The shift was minor. It even relieved a little bit of the pressure around his groin. Remember, he'd been pinned in that agonizing U shape for who knows how long. He could wiggle his hips and but a tiny bit now, maybe an inch or two of clearance, but definitely not enough to even think about escaping. As dusk settled in, he drifted off to sleep. Sometime before dawn, he was jolted awake by a searing pain in his armpit. He'd known all along that the flies were up to no good in there, probably eating away at his skin. He'd made his peace with that. As long as it wasn't another centipede, he wasn't going to complain. But this pain was different. It was excruciating. The bites were coming fast and furious, and he could feel a lot of things moving around in there. But that pain, as bad as it was nothing compared to what came next. Now, I really don't want to tell this part of the story. Just thinking about it makes me want to crawl out of my skin. But it's crucial to Charlie's experience, so here goes. And I am truly sorry you have to read this. Remember that shifting of the dirt. Turns out, it was caused by an ant colony collapsing. A big one. All those ants had come up out of the wreckage, and they'd been hanging out on the surface of the dirt, right below Charlie's hips. But as he'd started to settle into his new position overnight, the ants got agitated, and they swarmed him. His groin. Yeah, it's as bad as you're picturing. Ants crawling into his, and his, The only thing that made this part of the story even remotely bearable at that New Year's dinner was how hard my grandma, Betty, was laughing. You gotta get real close to see the scars. she cackled, tears streaming down her face. My brother's new girlfriend turned green and had to leave the room. Betty and Charlie just shared a kiss, and he kept on with the story like it was no big deal. So, with ants having a party in his most sensitive areas, and flies turning his armpit into their own personal breeding ground, Charlie suffered through the next 2 days in a haze of pain and delirium. The lack of food and water was taking its toll, he said. In a way, it was almost helpful. The pain became less sharp as he drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, a tarantula wandered into the hole. Charlie somehow managed to bite its abdomen in half and suck out whatever was inside. This, of course, attracted even more flies, but there was nothing he could do about it. He needed to eat something or he was going to die, survival instinct or not. A couple more days blurred by. He figured he'd been stuck for about a week. The rain and the insect meals had kept him hydrated enough to stay alive, barely. His armpit was numb all the way down to his last rib on his right side. The flies were pretty much ignoring everything else and just going in and out of the pit. The ant situation had calmed down a bit, but every now and then he'd feel a sharp pinch in a place you really don't want to be pinched. Then, one afternoon, he heard something that gave him a flicker of hope at gunfire. Charlie had heard gunfire plenty of times while he was trapped, but it was always far off in the distance, too far to offer any real hope of rescue. This time, though, it was close. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he was going to get out of this alive. But that hope was mixed with a new fear. What if it was the wrong side that found him? But then, to his astonishment, it wasn't the VC he heard shouting after the gunfire died down. It was American voices. Charlie started waving his arm, the only part of him that could still move, as much as he could. He heard someone yell, "Hey, there's an arm over here." Charlie yelled back a garbled, incoherent cry for help. And then the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen, a U.S. soldier, peering down at him from the edge of the hole. It took 10 minutes for the soldier and his squad mates to dig Charlie out. He remembers every single one of them saying some variation of, "Holy fucking shit," when they finally got him free. Someone radioed their position. "You're after an indeterminate amount of time." Time had lost all meaning for Charlie by this point. A helicopter landed in a nearby clearing. They loaded Charlie onto a stretcher and lifted off. A medic on board cut off what was left of Charlie's shirt and promptly threw up. When the other soldiers saw what the medic had seen, a few of them joined in, adding their own vomit to the mix, raining down from the side of the chopper. A few days later, Charlie woke up in a hospital. Not a field hospital, either. A real one back in the States. He had no idea how he'd gotten there. Once he was rescued, he'd passed out and slept for almost 36 hours straight. Some people thought he was in a coma until some poor medic tried to wake him up, and Charlie, still half out of it, said "fuck off," and knocked the guy out with one punch. Now that he was fully awake, the doctors filled him in on the extent of his injuries. Aside from the severe dehydration, he was riddled with infected bites. The ones on his sensitive areas weren't actually that serious, despite being incredibly unpleasant. It was the bigger bites that were a real problem. The red ant bite near his eye was dangerously infected, and for a while they were worried he might lose the eye. His lips and nose were swollen to grotesque proportions from the centipede bites. But even with all of that, he could have recovered in a few weeks and been back in action. But his armpit, that was a whole different story. That's why they sent him home. Turns out, there's this lovely little insect called a botfly, and they lay their eggs inside flesh. I linked a picture earlier, and I'm still sorry about that. Until Charlie's little adventure, nobody even knew they had them in Vietnam. But they do. And the underside of Charlie's right arm, all the way down to nearly his hip, had been transformed into a living incubator for botfly larvae. The doctors wouldn't operate. They said the only way to get them out was to let them mature, and then, at a certain point, suffocate them with adhesive tape so they'd crawl to the surface. It took a few more weeks, but that's exactly what happened. Charlie regaled us with the story of how he personally gave birth to 313 botfly larvae. Then, he lifted up his shirt and showed us the pockmarked, scarred skin as proof. Nobody really said much after that. Charlie was done with his story. He shoveled a piece of fruitcake into his mouth, and he and Betty headed for the door, laughing the whole way. I don't really know what else to say. That's my grandpa, Charlie, one of a kind. Happy New Year, I guess. And that, my friends, is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least survived it. Let me know what you think. And maybe think twice before you complain about your next family dinner. It could always be worse. You could be hearing this story firsthand. All right, let me tell you about something that happened to me. Something I barely ever talk about. Seriously, not even my own family knows about this. And yeah, I know that sounds weird. But trust me, it makes way more sense to spill my guts to random internet strangers than the people I'm stuck with. There's this awesome narrator, Mr. Nightmare, who actually read this story once on his channel, and I was stoked about the discussion it started. But I figured it's time to rewrite it, clear up some confusion, you know. So, without further ado, let's dive in. This all went down when I was a kid. I'd have to hit up my folks to know the exact year of this camping trip from hell, but I can say for sure it was at least a decade ago. Now, I'm gonna use some if-I words to describe where we were. Words like wooded and wilderness reserve, because honestly, I don't know the perfect words for this place. So, picture this: about 10 years ago, my buddy from church, Ethan, asks me to tag along on a camping trip with his family to this wilderness reserve called Osas State Park. Now, Ethan was my best friend, and his family was always super nice, so obviously, I said yes. I'd only been camping a couple of times before, so the idea of camping with my best bud and his fam seemed like the best thing ever. We started prepping for a weekend when I was free. I got my own tent, my own sleeping bag, the whole 9 yards. Once I had all my gear, Ethan's dad, Mr. Miller, swung by to pick me up, and my parents waved me off. I remember a bunch of stuff from that trip. The New Mexico countryside, which is like super hostile but also beautiful, the plateaus, and the campsite itself. Most people don't dream of camping in the New Mexican wilderness, At least not that I know of. But Osa State Park is different. The camping spots are all pretty decent, even if the prime ones are always snagged first. There's a nice lake, tons of wildlife, and, I hate to admit it, more trees than I'd ever seen in town. Yeah, I know, trees and New Mexico don't usually go together, and for a good reason. They're not exactly growing on, well, you get the idea, especially out in the plains unless some dude planted them. Anyway, Osas has enough trees that I can just call it the woods, and you'll get the picture. So, we roll up, find a sweet spot, and start setting up our tents. By afternoon, the tents were up, and me and Ethan ditch his little sister, Chloe, who was being so boring, to go explore the park. And man, the memories from that day are awesome. We found a snake by the lake and watched it drink before it slithered away. We explored this super sandy area. We saw a roadrunner just doing its roadrunner thing. We messed around all day after lunch and saw so much cool stuff that by the end of the day, I never would have guessed anything could go wrong. We wrapped up the day like you always do on a camping trip. Gathered a bunch of sticks, started a fire, roasted marshmallows for s'mores, and told ghost stories. None of the stories were actually scary, though. Probably because me and Ethan were just kids, and Chloe was even younger. Plus, Mr. Miller was the lead singer at our church, and giving kids nightmares wasn't good for his rep. So, bye. Ghost stories. I mean more like silly little stories that made us giggle, not scream. Lame, I know, but what are you gonna do? Anyway, after the stories were told and the s'mores were devoured, we all turned in for the night. Me in my tent, and Ethan, Mr. Miller, and Chloe in theirs. Now, let me explain the setup here, because it's important. My tent was on one edge of the campsite, and Ethan's was on the complete opposite side. This was for privacy, you know. On my side of the site, there was this little trail that went through some thick bushes to the lake. There was also this little tree, like 3 feet from my tent. I don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was young and small. The trail to the lake was to the left of my tent opening. The lake was behind my tent, and a thin line of trees was across a trail in front of it. That trail in front of my tent led to the bathrooms. So I hit the hay without a single worry, but before I did, I decided to take a leak on that little tree outside my tent because, let's be real, I was lazy. Who wants to walk 2 whole minutes to the bathroom when nature's toilet is right there? I finished zipping up my tent and crawled into my sleeping bag, ready to crash. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, I had to pee again, and this time it was the kind you can't really do on a tree, at least not without making a mess. So, since I'm not a complete idiot who'd just wander around in the dark, I grabbed my little lantern. I flicked on my LED lantern and unzipped the inner flap of my tent before the outer one, as if that flimsy little net could protect me from what I was about to see. Now, I should probably mention that outside of cities in New Mexico, hearing coyote howls is pretty normal. It's like a nightly serenade when you're camping. Heck, even in a small town like Logan, you can hear them from your bedroom window. It's not that big of a deal when you're inside a house. But when all you've got is some thin nylon walls separating you from the wild, yeah, it's not the most comforting sound. As I unzipped my tent flap, I did hear a few howls, but they were far away and didn't bother me. What froze me in my tracks was this super loud howl that came from the direction of the lake, at most a yard from my tent. But this howl was different. It had that coyote vibe, but it was way deeper, and it went on for way longer. I just sat there, scared stiff, staring at the zipper I still had my fingers on. I couldn't even guess how long I sat there, breathing hard, just frozen. But however long it was just long enough for the thing that made that howl to come up the trail right next to my tent. Suddenly, I heard the crunching of claws on dirt, and then claws on the rocks that made up our campsite. Then I saw it, the biggest shadow of any living creature I had ever seen in my young life. It moved slowly, heavily, in the direction of the thin tree line where I guess the other howls were coming from. But before it got past the tree I peed on, it stopped. Then it hit me. I was lit up like a Christmas tree, and I hadn't even tried to quiet my heavy breathing. By then, it was too late. That huge thing lumbered closer to the tree and into the light of my lantern. Even though the little LED light was dim at that distance, it was just enough to make out some details. All right, so there I was, practically glowing in my tent, and this massive thing is right outside. Now, I need to point out a few really weird details that stuck with me. It had fur that was kinda like a coyote's in color, but it had that classic dogman head shape, with those pointy little ears that were way too small to make sense on something that size. And the noises it made as it dropped to all fours in front of my tent, it was like this popping sound, like joints rubbing together. I can only guess its knees popped out of their standing joints and fell into different ones to let it get down on all fours. It sniffed the tree I'd peed on, totally ignoring me for a second, which was probably a good thing, since I was scared out of my mind. The breaths it took were like a dog's, but longer and way deeper, almost like a horse's. Then that thing turned its head and looked straight at me, right into my eyes. Its eyes didn't glow or anything cheesy like that. They didn't pierce my soul or whatever, but they were just unnatural. And above everything else I saw in those eyes, I saw a predator. Have you ever been in a situation where you made eye contact with an animal you know is stronger than you? Something you just know could kill you, and you know it knows you know. It was just looking for what felt like forever. I was sure I'd just be a bloody smear by the time anyone got to my tent. Screaming wouldn't do anything. I honestly doubted a gun would even hurt this thing. But despite every feeling in my gut, despite the dread of knowing it was a predator and I was its prey, I didn't die. Instead, it turned, slowly, ever so slowly, and then just sprinted off into the woods. Just like that, it was gone. Vanished into the night faster than it came. I have this one buddy who knows about this, and he jokes that maybe it was my pee on that tree. Like I marked my territory or something dumb like that. Or maybe it just wasn't hungry. Or the least likely option, it actually had some morals and didn't want to kill a kid. I'll never really know for sure. Needless to say, I didn't go to the bathroom. I just turned off my lantern, zipped up my tent flap, and held it all night. I don't remember sleeping at all. I might have, I might not have, but if I did, it was dreamless. I do remember trying to act normal the next day. I asked Ethan and his family if they heard any howling. They said they did, but they just figured it was coyotes being coyotes. They told me to just ignore it, like I was some city kid who'd never heard a coyote before. That next day, I stuck to Ethan like glue while we were exploring, and I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing by lunchtime. Somehow, feeling safe during the day pushed that beast out of my mind until we found tracks in that super sandy place. Coyote tracks. I think seeing those tracks made it all real for me again, that it wasn't just some nightmare. Because of that, I was so freaked out that night that I convinced Ethan's family to let me sleep in their tent. Even in the warmth of their bigger tent, so more people, more warmth, and with Mr. Miller there, an actual adult, and Ethan and Chloe, I couldn't sleep. I'd almost drift off, and then I'd hear a coyote howl. The next day I faked being sick so my mom would drive up and take me home a day or two early. Worst camping trip ever. It ruined not only my whole summer but also camping for me. I haven't gone camping without a tent buddy since, and I don't plan to. Even then, I'm always on edge, listening for weird noises and acting all paranoid. This whole thing really messed me up, I guess. Being forced to see that a human, top of the food chain, and all that, is totally helpless in front of a beast like that. Seriously, I don't think I can explain how powerless I felt. Even now, when I think about it, two things always hit me first: those eyes, and that feeling. Just writing this sent shivers down my spine multiple times. So, you might be wondering why I'm even talking about this again, if it terrifies me so much. Simple. I want answers, and I want to add to the conversation. I feel like I need to share this encounter so others can hear it. Maybe hit me up with questions or answers. So, if you have any idea what happened that night, please respond or DM me. And if you have any questions, go ahead and do the same. I need to know what that thing was, and if anyone else has seen something like it. Alright, so it's about time I finally spit this out. I'm not getting any younger, and this is the kind of story that, well, people need to hear, especially with the way things are going in the world right now. This was back when I was wet behind the ears at the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. Yeah, that's it. I was stuck in a unit the guys like to joke was the Night Stalker unit. Our job was basically dealing with the weird stuff, the cases labeled CZE, that's classified zoological entities. Anything found out there in the wild that needed special handling and, a whole lot of diplomatic tiptoeing. Dogman, Sasquatch, merfolk, you name it. Any of those things that just laughed in the face of science. Showed they were maybe a little too smart, or could flat out mess you up in a heartbeat. That's what we dealt with. And we had to be real careful about it, real discreet. If some regular Joe had a run in with a CZE, we usually didn't get involved. Unless, of course, they got some kind of proof, pictures, whatever, that could blow the creature's cover. That wasn't cool. What did get us going were the cases of, let's call it, negative contact. If some big company was trying to build where they shouldn't, messing with the local CZE population, or some trigger-happy hunters were trying to bag a trophy, or, God forbid, if a CZE, or a bunch of them, decided to make a family or a town their own personal punching bag. Or, like in this story I'm gonna tell you, someone ends up dead, looking like they got on the wrong side of a CZE. This whole mess went down in '83. I was just a greenhorn back then, working under my mentor, a guy named Marcus Mack, Abernathy. Mack was a legend in the parks and wildlife world. We got the call to head out to a park area called the Land Between the Lakes, over by Kentucky and Tennessee. A pretty popular spot for hunting, hiking, and camping, the whole outdoorsy deal. It was before the big summer rush when this family, bless their hearts, pulled their RV into the campground up in the northern part of the area. They were probably picturing s'mores and sunshine, a perfect family camping trip. What they got was straight out of a nightmare. The report came in about 8 hours after some poor local found the family. By then, the local cops and park rangers had already seen the whole gruesome scene. The family had been, well, there's no nice way to say it. They were butchered, ripped apart like some wild animal or an axe murderer got to them. And that's how it landed on our desks. Mac and I got to the scene and tried to smooth things over with the local law enforcement. Get them busy with crowd control and patrols. Basically, anything to keep them from having to process a scene like that. The campsite looked like something out of a horror movie. The dad was lying just outside the camper door, split right down the middle. There was a shotgun next to him. Looked like he only got off one shot, and from the looks of it, he didn't hit anything but dirt. Inside the camper, it got worse. The little boy couldn't have been more than 11, was in pieces all over the main living area. Further back, in the bathroom at the rear of the camper, we found the mom. The bathroom door had been ripped off its hinges and crushed like a beer can. She had defensive wounds, so at least she tried to fight back. Mac was the one who noticed there were clothes and dolls for a little girl in the camper, too. We searched all over, praying she got away, that she was hiding somewhere. We found her about 40 yards away, 20 feet up in a pine tree, torn apart and stuck up there on a branch. I'd never seen anything so awful. Mac, he looked like he was gonna puke or pass out. I'd never seen him so angry, either. After we got ourselves together, we started trying to piece things together. Everything pointed to a dogman attack, what we called a black dog case back at the DNR. The dad was probably lured out by a noise or something tapping on the camper. Once he was taken care of, the mom and kids locked themselves in the bathroom. The thing, or things, ripped the door off, killed the mom, and then, well, you get the picture. Mac was convinced there was more than one, which meant this wasn't just some lone, rogue dogman. This was a serious threat to everyone in the area. Something had to be done, and I had no freaking clue what. After we made sure the teams had everything under control, which they mostly didn't, but what can you do? We went back to the cheap motel we'd rented nearby. I remember Mac spent most of the night out on the little balcony. smoking like a chimney and staring out at nothing. He looked like he was wrestling with something heavy, something really unpleasant. The next morning, I honestly couldn't tell if he'd even slept, but he looked at me hard and said there was a way to fix this, but that it was dangerous. He asked if I had the guts for it, and if I was sure. I told him I'd do anything to make things right for that family, and he just nodded. But he had this look on his face, like he was already seeing something bad happen. He told me to go into town and get supplies for a camping trip, enough for at least 3 or 4 days. We had tents and lights and stuff like that in the truck, so I just grabbed food, water, and the basic necessities. When I got back, I saw he had a bag of evidence from the scene. When I started to ask about it, he just nodded, checked the supplies, and told me to get in the truck. We drove further north into Kentucky, deep into the backwoods, where the paved roads turned to gravel, and then the gravel turned to dirt. We were following what looked like an old logging road, all overgrown and barely there. When we came to a fence marked protected land, we ditched the truck and started hiking deeper into the woods. It felt like we walked for most of the day. On the way, I noticed Mac picking prairie sage by the handful, stuffing it into a bag. We'd brought a bow and a few arrows, and Mac told me to keep an eye out for any small game we could take down. I spotted a decent-sized jackrabbit, and we managed to bag it, even though I'm no Robin Hood with a bow. It was nearly dark by the time we reached a spot that was flat and open enough to make camp. Once we got the camp set up and a fire going, Mac tossed in a handful of that sage he'd collected. The green leaves made this thick, acrid smoke that just hung in the air. It reminded me of my grandma, who used to burn sage around her house all the time. I asked him if I should clean the rabbit so we could have some dinner, but he said the rabbit wasn't for us. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the heck we were doing out there, but nothing made sense. Finally, I just had to ask. Mac looked up at the fading light, took a deep breath, and started talking. "What we're here to do," he said, "is something we don't do lightly. I haven't done it in close to 20 years, and I don't reckon I'll ever need to do it again. It was taught to me by my granddaddy and his granddaddy before him, and before him, the Native Americans, who either learned it from their elders or figured it out on their own. You know those creatures, the ones responsible for that horror back at the park. They've been around longer than any of us. Before the settlers, before even the Native Americans we know from history books. Our relationship with them has changed over the years. Sometimes they had the upper hand, and we lived in fear of the woods. Sometimes we had the upper hand, and they were forced back deeper in to keep away from our guns and our machine guns. As you know," he continued, "they're smart, real smart. Maybe not smart like us, I guess. I believe they were a sort of evolutionary crossroads, where humans split between the thinking, planning type and the more primal, instinctual type. They evolved down a different path, a more natural path, you might say. They may not speak our language or build cities, but they're just as sharp, just as observant and adaptable, maybe even more so, seeing as how they don't have language and history books cluttering up their heads." The point is, they're not animals, not like wolves or bears. They're on the same level as us, evolution-wise. And because of that, we have to treat our dealings with them like, well, like diplomacy. We don't want to live in fear of them, he went on, and they want to be left alone. To keep this peace, the ancient humans, they came up with a way to communicate, a way to reach out and make peaceful contact, even after something terrible happened. A sort of emergency line, you could call it, and he paused to throw more sage on the fire. Of course, he said, voice low, this isn't something either side enjoys. The dogmen, they've got a powerful distrust of humans, built up over centuries, and I can't say I blame them. They respect us as a threat, but they pretty much despise us as a species. Not all of them, of course. Just like us, there are some who are more peaceful, and some who'd wipe us out if they could. That's why this whole thing is so risky for us. I remember feeling kind of numb, like his words were just bouncing around in my head, and I couldn't grab onto them. Was he seriously telling me we were about to meet with one of the dogmen? A whole pack even, to talk to them, ask for their help? I just sat there like a statue while he talked and threw more sage on the fire. The ritual, he said, calling it that for the first time. My granddaddy called it a ritual. It has to be followed to the letter. The meeting place is deeper in the woods, and we can't bring any weapons or tools or even clothes. Nothing but the offering and the evidence. This puts us completely at their mercy, and that's the only way they'll even let us get close. That was the first thing that really landed. No weapons. No clothes. I thought he had to be kidding, but when I looked at his face, I could see he wasn't just serious, he was scared. Seeing a man like Max scared, that's something I'll never forget. He tossed another bunch of sage on the fire and gestured to it. The sage burning, he said, that's part of the ritual. The Native Americans believed it warded off evil spirits. My granddaddy had a different idea. He called it an olfactory beacon. A strong smell to get their attention, one they associate with this whole contact ritual, letting them know we're coming. He lifted a branch of the sage to his nose before tossing it into the flames. We waited until the moon was high, and the path was lit enough for us to see where we were going, even in the dark. I was staring up at the moon through my tent wall when Mac called to me and said it was time. My stomach did a whole gymnastics routine, and I crawled out of the tent to see the fire was out and Mac was already completely bare. I took off my clothes, feeling numb and more than a little freaked out. I'd never felt so vulnerable in my life, standing there in the dark woods, naked and shivering. It wasn't even that cold, but I was shaking like a leaf. I grabbed the rabbit we'd killed and kind of clutched it to my chest, trying to feel a little less exposed. Before we set out, Mac grabbed a handful of ashes from the fire pit, held it out, and blew a puff of soot over me. Then he tossed the rest on himself, and then we started walking. We walked, and we walked, and we walked. It felt like we walked forever, like the sun was gonna come up any minute. Up until then, the forest had been, alive with sound. Birds in the trees, bugs chirping and whirring, the whole nature orchestra playing. But at some point, everything went dead quiet. like someone had found the volume knob on the woods and turned it all the way down. I hesitated for a second, but then I remembered what Mac told me. Walk steady and calm. He'd said, keep your eyes on the path. Don't pay any attention to anything you might see or hear, and most importantly, don't look at anything if it looks at you. So we kept walking, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the crunch of leaves under our bare feet. Then I started to hear something moving in the woods off to our left. Something big. I kept my eyes locked on the path ahead, just like Max said, but I could hear it, whatever it was, trailing us, matching our pace. Then came a sound from our right, this deep, low, guttural growl that made your insides clench and your teeth vibrate. I'd heard the researchers at the DNR talk about infrasound, a kind of low, frequency sound that can make people feel anxious and scared, even if they don't know why. They said it was in a tiger's roar, and that our reaction to it might be tied to some ancient, primal fear. Maybe it wasn't tigers they should have been worried about, after all. Being there in the dark, naked as the day I was born, with nothing between me and them, I can't even begin to describe how terrified I was. As we walked, those two, or whatever they were, kept right alongside us. Then, one of them jumped onto the path behind us and let out another one of those bone, rattling growls and charged. I could hear the leaves crunching, feel the thud of its feet hitting the dirt not 2 feet behind me. It took every ounce of willpower I had not to spin around and bolt, screaming like a little girl. I heard it slide to a stop, felt the dirt and sticks it kicked up hit the back of my legs, but I just kept walking, and Mac did, too. I couldn't feel my body anymore. I was so scared. All I could do was focus on putting one foot in front of the other and keeping my eyes straight ahead. When Mac finally stopped, we were in a clearing. The grass and prairie sage were all silvery in the moonlight, which was so bright it almost looked like daytime. For a moment, we just stood there. The forest was still and silent as a graveyard. Then, I caught a glint of something, eyes reflecting the moonlight in the bushes ahead of us. A large shape emerged from the tree line in front of us. It moved on all fours, low to the ground, its black fur seeming to absorb all the light around it. A living shadow with 2 glowing orbs where its eyes should be. 2 others came out beside it, like bodyguards. One of them looked like it was made of spun silver in the moonlight, and its eyes had a spark in them, like amber when you rub it on wool. The other one had patches of black and dark red eyes, like the dying embers of a fire. I almost lost it when I felt hot breath on the back of my legs and heard a snuffling sound. I twitched, and the thing behind me let out another low, warning growl. Then I felt its cold nose touch the back of my leg as it sniffed and circled me. Another one, a big black one, was circling Mac too. I couldn't see his face, but the way he stood there, so still and calm, it kind of helped slow down the frantic pounding in my ears. The one circling me growled again and tried to look up into my eyes. I looked away fast, dodging its stare like a nervous kid being confronted by a cop. It lunged at me, and I heard the snap of its teeth, felt the rush of air as it bit at the air in front of my crotch. A shudder went through me, and I was suddenly very glad I'd emptied my bladder before we left camp. The largest of the three, the big black one, just eyed us for a long moment. Then it shifted. Something inside it popped, like a twig snapping in a wet towel, and it slowly rose up onto two legs. The other two did the same. The two on the sides had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. Easy, but the big black one, it had to be closer to 10 feet. I'd never seen anything so massive so close before. It was so tall it almost blocked out the moon. Mac looked at me and made a gesture toward the rabbit I was still clutching. I felt like I was moving in slow motion, like my body wouldn't respond. A low growl from behind me snapped me out of it, and I stepped forward. I could feel their eyes on me, like hot pokers held inches from my skin, just waiting for an excuse to close the gap. I laid the rabbit down at the feet of the largest one, stepping into its shadow. It felt like stepping into a vast, open mouth, like I might just disappear. A snort came from somewhere high above me, and I felt something sniffing at my hair. To my absolute horror, a long snout entered my field of vision, then a muzzle, then those bright, bioluminescent eyes. Something left me in that moment, like it had reached inside me and taken something. I don't know what. I tore my gaze away from those points of light in the black mass in front of me. It took everything I had. Then I stepped back, carefully moving back to Mac's side. The largest one sniffed at the rabbit, then made a gesture to one of the others. The one with the amber eyes grabbed the hare in one hand, and even though I thought it had been a pretty big rabbit, it looked like a kitten in its grip. It disappeared back into the woods with it, and Mac took the bag of evidence from under his arm. He started pulling things out, one by one, and laying them on the ground in front of him. There was a piece of bloodied cloth, a wedding band stained black with dried blood, a child's shoe, and finally, a lock of blonde hair. The alpha sniffed at each item intently, growling low when it got to the hair. It stood up to its full height and watched as Mac pulled out the last few things from the bagra, a clump of fur found in the father's hand, some saliva samples taken from the bodies, and a small vial of urine, soaked dirt from near the campsite. The alpha sniffed at these too, then snorted and stood there for a moment, just looking at them. It let out a deep growl, then turned and, with one long stride that seemed to cover the whole distance in an instant, disappeared back into the darkness, like a cloud passing in front of the moon. The others followed, looking back at us with low, warning growls. After they were gone, Mac and I just stood there, in shock, I guess. It felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound of the forest came back. The crickets, the birds, everything. It was like someone had turned the volume back up. A huge weight lifted off of me, and I felt like I might pass out. Mac took a long breath in and let it out slow. He was shaking, just the tiniest bit. He looked at me and grinned. "I think she likes you," he said, and I almost fell over, my knees buckling. The trip back to camp seemed to happen in fast forward, like someone was rewinding a tape. Once we got back to the lanterns, Mac and I pulled on our clothes and crawled into our tents without a word. I felt like I'd never sleep again. My heart was still pounding so hard, but I ended up falling asleep, almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next few days were spent camping and waiting. Mac had told me we had to stay in the area until we got some kind of sign, some indication that they had done something about our mutual problem, as he put it. He told me about his first time performing the ritual. It hadn't been here, though he said he had contacted this particular pack before. Apparently, this was something that was done all over the country, in different areas. The ritual might change a little, depending on the region, but the basic idea was always the same. On the third night, we heard it, howling far off in the distance, but still deep and piercing. It sounded like a coyote pack when they all start singing in chorus, all that baying and howling and yipping at different volumes and intervals. It went on for a while, then faded away. The next morning, we found them, laid out on the ground in front of our campfire, three massive, clawed hands, severed at the wrist, lined up in a row. Max smiled when he saw them. "Looks like they took care of it," he said, lifting one up to examine it. He handed one to me, and it was heavier than it looked, like holding a really big, really heavy gun for the first time. The one hand was bigger than both of mine put together, and the long claws at the end of each finger had to be 5 inches long, and they were slightly retracted. The fur on each hand was a different color, and each one was clearly a left hand. Mac dropped each one into a separate bag, saying the lab guys would be thrilled. He said dogmen were pretty good at collecting their dead, so remains were hard to come by for the DNR researchers. And then, just like that, we packed up and left. We hadn't heard of any more activity in the area, and we told everyone we were authorized to tell that the situation was resolved, that we'd made a highly successful contact. After that, I felt like a minor celebrity back at the DNR. It was something I'll never forget, that's for sure, and something I wouldn't even consider doing again unless things got really, really bad. But with the reports we've been getting lately, it's looking like we might not even be able to do it anymore, even if we wanted to. We don't know why been getting more active and aggressive lately, but it sure as hell makes the whole peaceful coexistence thing a lot more shaky. What that means for the future, well, I try not to think about it too much. I can only hope for the best, but yeah, I definitely fear the worst. It keeps me up some nights. A lot of nights, actually. And that's the story. It's the God's honest truth, as best as I can remember it. I just hope that by telling it, maybe it'll help someone somewhere, someday. Or at least, maybe they'll understand that the world is a whole lot stranger and a whole lot more dangerous than they think. Look, I didn't tell our Dr. Evans about the lady with the bleeding eyeballs. You know, the one who kept hanging around in the stairwell whenever I got up to pee in the middle of the night. And honestly, who could blame me? There was no way to bring it up without him thinking I was completely nuts. Oh, it's been rough, Doc. My memory's shot, my mouth's always dry. I'm on an emotional roller coaster. And oh yeah, sometimes I see this shadowy figure creeping around upstairs. So instead of, taking a leak, I end up shoving a dresser in front of the bedroom door. Crazy, right? If I'd said that, his fancy pen would have probably gone flying across that little notepad of his. Or maybe he would have just saved himself the trouble and slapped that big rubber stamp on my file. CRI file B. He could probably tell things weren't exactly sunshine and rainbows at home just by looking at the bags under my eyes. Still, I forced a smile while he lobbed a bunch of loaded questions at me about my fragile mental state. At the end of our session, the doc leaned forward in his armchair, so close I could count his nose hairs, and said, "We all just want what's best for everyone, Sarah." "Of course," I replied, my fingers practically digging into the armrests. I picked Ethan up from school. Back home, Olivia was glued to her phone, as usual. After 30 minutes of me practically begging, they both got down to their homework while I threw together a beef stew. We ate in silence. Afterwards, Olivia went out with some friends I'd never even heard of. I told her to be back by 11, but at 16, who listens to their mom, right? Ethan changed into his PJs, and then we read the latest Adventures of Superfido book in his room. I lived for those moments. In another 3 years, puberty would hit, and then lying next to his mom would be, like, the most embarrassing thing ever. To really top off the night, I tortured myself by flipping through some old photo albums. The wind was howling around the roof, and it yanked me awake. Down the hall, I heard these bony fingers scraping across the bookshelves and floorboards. I pulled a pillow over my head to block it out, but these awful images of twisted metal and blood, spattered glass kept me up until morning. Still half asleep, I shuffled into the living room. A single Nerf dart was lying on the windowsill. Those stupid things kept appearing, even though I'd confiscated Ethan's blaster weeks ago. I went over and pulled the curtain back. Down below, past the ivy wall, old Mr. Henderson was trimming the hedge that separated our gardens. He looked up and gave a friendly wave. I managed a half-hearted one back. Retirement for Mr. Henderson and his wife basically meant lots of time to be nosy neighbors. I almost asked if they'd seen anyone lurking around my house last night. At our next appointment, Dr. Evans asked about Emily. 10 minutes and a whole box of tissues later, I told him about my 9th birthday, when this kid with a ton of freckles at the playground demanded a kiss. I said no because his breath was worse than a sewer, so he grabbed the Tamagotchi clipped to my belt and smashed it with a rock. I ran home crying to Emily, who marched me right back there and pinned the little jerk down beside the swings. Since he wouldn't apologize, she yanked the light-up sneakers off his feet, tied the laces together, and tossed them up around a lamppost. "She sounds like a wonderful sister," the doc said, handing me another box of tissues. In the kitchen, the sight of the recycling bin overflowing with wine bottles nearly sent me into a full-blown panic attack. They didn't disappear when I rubbed my eyes, so I tore the house apart and found a pill packet under the clock on the bookshelf. Did I black out again? If the neighbors saw me stumbling around wasted, that info might have gotten back to the good doctor. Or worse, my darling ex-husband. I dumped the bottles at the recycling center on my way to get Ethan. Over breakfast, Olivia dropped the bomb that she was going to see some band called Wolf Alice play in London. "I'll be back Sunday," she said, like it was no big deal. Olivia, just like her dear aunt, had straight blonde hair and green eyes. Ethan and I were all curly brown hair and chubby cheeks. I sighed. Who are you going with? Where are you staying? And when were you planning on telling me? James and Emma. James's brother's flat. And dead. Now. Rubbing my temples to try and stop a monster headache, I took a deep breath, held it, and tried to push all that toxic air out. Then came the argument we'd had a million times before. It was like we were reading from a script. Her. You're the worst with all these stupid rules. Me. I don't know these people. It's too dangerous. In my head, I could hear my mom's voice, loud and angry. The whole thing ended with Olivia storming off to her room. Next time Dr. Evans asked about Emily, I managed to hold back the tears long enough to tell him about how we learned the dance routine to Wanaba by the Spice Girls in our parents' living room. When that second chorus hits, you're supposed to lean forward and kick your leg back. And I did it so hard and so fast that I accidentally punted Mom's porcelain cat, the one that's always batting at an invisible ball of string. Emily picked it up, and the face was cracked right down the middle. My blood pressure went through the roof and didn't come down until Baby Spice, aka Emily, hugged me tight and ran her fingers through my hair. That always calmed me down. Once I stopped sobbing, she promised she'd tell our parents it was her fault, not mine. When Dad's Ford pulled into the driveway, I hid in the bedroom with a pillow over my head so I wouldn't hear them yelling. My sister's bravery earned her a bunch of nasty bruises. Part of me wanted to tell Dr. Evans about the Nerf darts, but he'd clearly already labeled me a basket, case the second my file landed on his desk. No point in handing him the evidence, right? With all the grace of a constipated hippo, he steered the conversation toward my ex. I explained how my marriage felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells. Early on, I once casually mentioned I wasn't a huge fan of driving, and by the time Ethan was potty trained, if I so much as said I needed to pop to the store, Ben would snap back with, "No, you hate driving. I'll take you." Of course, Dr. Evans thought Ben was a real stand-up guy. Man's man, who loved a good laugh, you know. Hell of a golfer, too. They ran into each other at the driving range all the time. Funny that. I leaned forward in the chair, made my voice all serious, and said, "The day Ben and I split up, I locked myself in the bathroom because I couldn't take his screaming anymore. And do you know what that bastard did? He used a credit card to jimmy the lock open and yell in my face some more. And are you still drinking?" I shrank back in my chair. No bow. Every other weekend, Ben would swoop in and take the kids for some quality time. Our divorce had turned into a total shit show. He demanded full custody because of my alarming behavior, but the judge shot that down because he had a nasty habit of punching drivers who stole his parking spots or cut him off. If you talk to our friends and family, they all knew about his temper, but they mostly waved it off with stuff like, "Have you seen how people drive around here?" With the kids gone, I turned every room upside down looking for more meds. Weeks earlier, during a mandatory inspection, a social worker almost found enough Cipralex to tranquilize a horse under my mattress. By some miracle, I spotted the foil wrapper at the very last second and stuffed it up my sleeve, narrowly avoiding getting hauled off to the loony bin right then and there. Alone in the empty house, the grief hit me in waves. My mind kept replaying these awful images of a cracked windshield, flashing ambulance lights reflecting in the spiderweb of glass. At midnight, feeling brave enough to finally use the bathroom, I got out of bed and stepped into the hall. Up ahead, the living room door creaked open. I froze. The cold, stale air in the house dropped like 10 degrees as that door eased inward, revealing this thick darkness. From inside the room, a pair of bulging eyes stared at me, all wet and shiny with blood. I bolted back into my room, pushed the dresser against the door, and dove under the covers like a terrified kid. I was already on the verge of losing it, so I used a pillow to block out the sound of those heavy footsteps shuffling around the house. Every now and then, I could feel the figure's presence radiating through the door, which was almost worse than actually seeing it. 6 sleepless hours later, I finally ventured into the living room. Crimson pools of blood covered the floorboards like little ink blots, all around a single Nerf dart. I scrubbed the floor with scalding water until my fingers were raw. The dart, like all the others, went in the trash. Not that it ever did any good. More would show up, and I knew why. It was a punishment, a way of reminding me the accident was all my fault. I told Dot Evans that Emily was the ultimate cool aunt, and how that coolness rubbed off on me. Take our Nerf war, for example. It started when I came home to an empty house one evening. Emily, who was supposed to be babysitting, wasn't answering her phone. After a few minutes of yelling the kids' names, I heard whispering from the bathroom. I already had 911 on hold, and I raced to the shower and ripped the curtain back. A hail of Nerf bullets hit me in the face, and I screamed so loud the old folks next door swore their ears were ringing for a week. There were the kids, on either side of Emily, doubled over with laughter, proud of their little prank. And 4 days later, after I finally stopped shaking, I had to admit they got me good. That kicked off the Nerf war. My sister and I ambushed each other at home, at the shops, even at pilots. Anywhere but work. Olivia and Ethan helped set up traps, switched sides, and even acted as human shields more than once. My best move was when Emily took Ethan to the playground one afternoon. After he jumped off the climbing frame, he told his aunt that a little girl had broken her arm inside the tube slide and needed help. Worried, she ran up the steps, crawled through the tube on her hands and knees, and found herself face to face with me. "You sneaky bitch," she laughed, as a Nerf bullet hit her right between the eyes. A tiny bit of that pent-up anxiety actually faded away while I was telling the story. Ben dropped the kids off on Sunday night. "How was it?" I asked Olivia as she walked into the kitchen. "Fine," she mumbled, making a cup of tea just for herself, not me. Before the accident, we used to take turns making tea and drink it together while watching Love Island or Bake Off. My blackouts put an end to that. After Ethan showered and got into his PJs, we reread an old Captain Underpants book, and then I went and knocked on Olivia's door, sitting on the edge of her bed. I told her I hated how distant we'd become. "Whose fault is that?" she snapped, turning away from me. I know I put you through hell, but I'm so much better now, I said, my voice cracking. Dad thinks you're drinking again. Says the neighbors do, too. What could I have said? Oh, your dad's not the superhero you think he is. During our whole relationship, if that master manipulator was happy, he let me be happy. But the second he stopped being happy, unfortunately, telling my daughter, that meant also convincing her she had a sociopath for a father. There was no low that man wouldn't stoop to if it made me look bad. I wallowed in bed, never managing to sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. Those bottles and pills weren't mine. I think it's hard to tell when every day just blurs into the next. Plus, if I had taken them, it might have caused another blackout. Maybe my drugged up self tiptoed around the house, leaving those Nerf bullets as some kind of self-torture. Maybe the doc was right. Maybe I had come unhinged again. At our next session, Dr. Evans finally asked about the accident. I swallowed hard and told him Emily had come over earlier that day. She wanted a girls' night out, but just the thought of it made my stomach churn. I thought getting divorced meant you didn't have to worry about what that bastard thinks anymore. She said, "We're not divorced, we're separated. Same difference. Besides, isn't he in Portugal golfing with his buddies? He'd find out," I said grimly. "I'd bump into someone who knows us. So glad that prick's gone," she muttered. "You know who he reminded me of. Don't even say it." On the sofa, we danced around my current predicament. She filled me in on her new job, the Vegas trip with her friends, and a bunch of other awesome life stuff I'd missed out on because Ben had isolated me from everyone. Emily, bless her heart, really tried to pull me out of that funk, but a permanent storm cloud had been hanging over me since the split. We hugged goodbye at the door. Then, 5 minutes later, while I was upstairs in the lounge clearing away our empty plates and cheese board, I spotted a weird lump behind the curtain. Before I could react, Emily jumped out from her hiding spot by the window and fired a dart straight at my forehead. Gotcha. For the first time in weeks, I actually laughed, and I knew right then that I'd get through the separation, or divorce, or whatever lay ahead. All I needed was a little support from my big sis. It took everything in me to tell Dr. Evans how, later that night. 2 cops showed up at the door and said there'd been an accident. There was more blood in the pictures of the wreck than I thought a human body could even hold. At the hospital, Emily was lying there motionless, her face covered in bandages stained red around the eyes. For 20 minutes, I picked pieces of glass out of her blood, matted hair, and whispered that she had to hold on because her little sis needed her. Then a doctor came in, said we needed to have a very difficult conversation, and explained that Emily had less brain activity than a can of soup. Keeping her on the respirator was just delaying the inevitable. Through tears, I insisted he not pull the plug. Emily was a fighter, the strongest person I knew. If it had been anyone else in that twisted metal cage, they would have died instantly. But not her. She'd held on for me. She was my protector. And I knew she'd always be there through thick and thin. Until suddenly, she wasn't. I never looked at the body. That let my imagination run wild, filling in the gaps. Images of a figure with skin ripped off and glass shards sticking out of a broken neck haunted me every waking moment. And those eyes, those awful, bleeding eyes. Dr. Evans's pen was scribbling away like crazy. The sound snapped me back to the present, and I stopped myself from telling him how. In the weeks after Emily died, life became a blur of blackouts mixed with pills and booze. I couldn't live with the guilt. If I hadn't called her that night, begging for a shoulder to cry on, she never would been driving on that exact stretch of highway when that damn 18-wheeler pulled out. The weeks went by in a whirlwind of missed school runs and forgotten lunches. Usually, my big sis would have swooped in to save the day during times like these. What was I supposed to do now that she was gone? One night, after I'd sobered up, Olivia started World War II by sneaking out late. 2 cops showed up in response to a domestic disturbance and declared me in a compromised state. Then came the investigations, the mandatory wellness checks. The court-ordered therapy. Ben worked overtime to paint me as the worst mother on the planet. A carefully placed comment to a teacher here. A chance meeting with Dr. Evans there. Keeping all this hidden became a full-time job. I couldn't let anyone find out that Emily was punishing me by creeping around and dropping Nerf bullets. Otherwise, they'd call it a coping mechanism, or an avoidance technique, or a hysterical mother who couldn't face reality. As I told Dr. Evans that the day Emily died, all the joy seeped out of the world. I couldn't help but wonder if the kids staying with me wasn't what was best for everyone. Could I really do this without my big sister watching over me? That feeling of despair lingered for the rest of the day. I sleepwalked through dinner and putting Ethan to bed. Images of the wreck haunted me as I lay there in bed. They brought along this feeling of coming untethered. I couldn't block them out. I physically needed, my big sister. I would have given anything to have her fingers running through my hair one last time. Just then, out in the hall, the floorboards creaked. Those creaks got louder, closer. Be careful what you wish for. I slipped under the blanket, squeezed my eyes shut, and told myself it was all in my head. All of a sudden, I couldn't breathe. The bedroom door creaked open while I lay there, paralyzed. The figure crawled across the floor and up onto my bed, the mattress springs groaning as the covers were pulled tight. Through the blanket, a forehead pressed against mine. Before the accident, this was the part where I called Emily. What was I supposed to do now that she'd come back from the dead to haunt me? Suddenly, the sheet was ripped away. I sat bolt upright, alone in the room. By the door, there sat a single Nerf bullet. Not again. This couldn't go on. Emily was gone, and she wasn't coming back. No matter how many bullets I stashed around the house. I threw on a robe and picked up the dart. 6 more were scattered across the landing like a trail. Clearly, I'd taken more pills and punished myself by setting up a scavenger hunt. Furious at myself, I crossed the hallway, picking them up as I went. From behind the living room door, there were more scrapes, bumps, bangs, but I couldn't hide forever. My kids needed me, which meant I had to face my problems, even if it meant facing them alone. I pushed open the living room door, and on the far side of the room, I saw a familiar face reflected in the glass. It was Emily, but she looked unhurt, the way I wished I could remember her. A warm feeling spread through my body. It was her. It was really, really her. The one who made the sadness go away with a joke or a well-timed hug. She'd come back. I ran across the room, shouting her name, telling her how much I missed her. As I pushed open the window, it hit something solid, and then a loud snap came from below. I leaned out. Down below, a shadowy figure was sprawled across the rose bushes, groaning. I thought it was a burglar, until I heard the intruder curse. I rushed downstairs, yelling at the kids to get back in their rooms as they leaned out their doors. Dashed around the side of the house, flipped on the porch light, and crossed the yard. Dressed all in black, my ex-husband was rolling around. His left shoulder popped out of its socket. "What the fuck are you doing here?" I shouted. "You stupid bitch," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Why are you opening a window in the middle of the fucking night?" A discarded backpack lay nearby. Ben tried to swat my arm away, but ended up clutching his shoulder and grimacing. Inside the pack were pills, empty wine bottles, and a bent, out-of-shape coat hanger. The bastard had been breaking in to frame me. The way the house was built, someone fit enough could climb up the ivy. Ben had clearly been using the hanger to unhook the window latch and force his way in. "You son of a bitch," I screamed, spit flying from my lips. "You've been making it look like I'm drinking again." He jumped up and threw himself at me hard. We both landed in the wet dirt, him on top. A gloved hand clamped around my throat. My vision started to fade as Ben screamed about what a terrible mother I was, and how he wished he'd killed me. How he was going to kill me. The garden and everything in it went black. The next thing I knew, I was staring up at Mr. Henderson, who was trying to wrestle Ben into a headlock. The world slowly came back into focus. On the other side of the hedge, a teary Mrs. Henderson was screaming into her phone, begging the police to hurry. For once, I was grateful we had the nosiest neighbors this side of the English Channel. If not for them, I might not have woken up. Drawn by the commotion, other neighbors came out of their houses while, above us, Olivia and Ethan leaned out of the living room window, their eyes wide with shock. My husband shoved Mr. Henderson off and turned on that phony charm. He'd only rushed over because I'd drunk, dialed him, you see. I'd told him I was going to kill the kids and then myself. He was just trying to protect his family. From the look on Olivia's face, I could tell she wasn't buying it. A few neighbors chased the bastard to his car, and then he almost ran over the whole crowd as he sped off. No doubt he'd try to twist the story later, but the kids saw what happened. That was enough. After 2 officers took a report from me and the Hendersons, I put a very upset Ethan to bed before turning in myself, my neck all tender and bruised. A few minutes later, Olivia came in carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought this might help your throat," she said, holding up my favorite Spice Girls mug. "There's honey in it." She stood there, her lower lip trembling, until I pulled back the covers and motioned for her to hop in. We lay there in silence for a while, her head on my chest, my fingers running through her blonde hair. Then she looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry about all those things I said before." I told her none of that mattered now. I wouldn't have believed me either. Soon, Ethan knocked on the door and asked to come in, and then the three of us lay there all cozy and snug. And for the first time since the accident, it felt like things might actually be okay, that my family would survive this awful mess, and nothing could ever tear us apart. After all, we had my big sis looking out for us. All right, so 2 locals went missing last week. We found one of them a couple of days ago just off South Slope Road, messed up bad. So bad we couldn't even tell who it was out of the two that disappeared. The other guy, still missing. But with all the crazy howling and screaming coming from the edge of town lately, I'm betting we ain't gonna find him, at least not in one piece. Damien, Sinclair, and the rest of his little fan club seem to think it's some kind of werewolf or some messed up animal that's wandered out of the woods. Command's got us prepping for anything, though. We're heading out tomorrow, the whole shebang. Supposed to be back within a week. I'm leading the night crawlers. That's my squad up the west side of the valley. The guys in the headless squad will take the east, and the Ironsides are gonna push up the middle, try to drive whatever this thing is towards one of our groups. Orders are to try and take it alive, but if that's not gonna happen, we can put it down. I've hunted my share of monsters by now, but the night before you head out, man, it's always the worst. You just never know who's gonna make it back, or in what shape. Sin sent over a fancy dinner, and some wine from his own stash, though. I guess it's a nice gesture, but it kinda feels like the last meal before you're executed. The guys are pumped, and I guess I will be too once we're out there, and I've got that buzz going. It's gonna be the last night in a real bed for a while, though, or maybe forever. Can't say I'm looking forward to sleeping on the ground and waking up all stiff and cold with pine needles stuck everywhere. All right, enough of that, time for bed. We were up before the sun, geared up in an hour, and all 3 squads met in the yard. The head honcho, old man, Rourke, met us there and gave us the rundown one more time. All right, listen up. Ironsides, you're staying ahead of everyone, keep it loud. We want this thing flushed to the edges of the valley. Squad leaders, stay in contact. Don't break formation. If you can drive this thing across the gray, Jake, you and the night crawlers go on alone. The others will hold the riverbank in case it loops back. You all got that? Rourke barked. Got it, I called out, along with everyone else. Good. Now get the hell out of here. I want a report from each squad leader every night. We marched out of the yard, and it took us an hour to reach Ravenhead. We went right through town on the way to South Slope Road. A few of the townsfolk who were just waking up waved or yelled, "Good luck," from their windows. The headless squad broke off first to take the east side, and it was just us and the Ironsides for a few more hours until they split off too. Being the furthest out, we were the last ones to get into position. We spread out, forming a staggered line. This close to Ravenhead, the Passgate forest has been cut way back. It's mostly just rolling hills and grass with a few clumps of trees and bushes here and there. But ahead of us, as we moved across the valley, those damn Passgate trees loomed, all tall and creepy. Those pines grow taller here than anywhere else in the world, but honestly, that's probably the least weird thing about this valley. Night crawlers in position, over, I said into my radio. Ironsides in position, over, crackled a voice back. Headless ready to roll, over, came another voice. Ironsides moving out. Give us an hour. Then start moving. I switched to the squad channel and told my guys we had an hour to kill, so hold tight and keep an eye on the tree lane. I set my pack down and leaned my rifle against it, pulled out a cigarette and lit it up, that iron-tasting smoke filling my lungs, waking me up properly. I looked down the line and saw a few other guys lighting up, too. I shook my legs out and sat down, leaning back against my pack. Even though I've been in them for years, these Pasgate woods still give me the creeps. I mean, they're full of monsters, so I guess that's a dumb thing to say. But it's more than that. The trees, the ground, the bushes, everything just feels wrong, somehow. I'm not great with words, but I guess you could say the forest just gives off a bad vibe, huh? Anyway, this is supposed to be a ranger's log, not my diary. Who cares what I think? We sat there for an hour, smoking and checking our guns, when the Ironsides finally called and told us to start moving. The headless leader and I both confirmed we were on our way, and I signaled my guys forward. I was on the far right of the line, and we were spread out so I could just barely see the next guy over. Enough to cover ground, but not so far that we couldn't help each other if something went down. You gotta go slow when you're trying to flush something out, especially when it's the kind of thing that could rip your face off. So, yeah, we weren't exactly booking it. The whole first day was pretty much a bust. One of my guys, Ben, found a footprint, but it was just a regular old wolf. Over on the other side of the valley, one of the headless squad guys shot a deer by accident. Clowns. I could even hear the Ironsides way up ahead, yelling and banging around. They were really laying it on thick, trying to scare this monster right into our laps. We paired up with the guy next to us and lit fires, taking turns sleeping so we could keep watch. The line of fires running through the woods would hopefully keep our target to the north of us. You'd think after marching all day with a heavy pack, sleep would come easy. It does, but then it's a real bitch to wake up. I took the first watch, so at least I got to sleep until sunrise. My partner, a guy named Marcus, nudged me awake with his boot and handed me a tin of eggs, bread, and bacon. I scarfed it down and washed it down with some coffee that had been boiling over the fire. Feeling warm and awake, we kicked out our fire and covered our tracks, then spread back out into our line. The Ironsides leader's voice crackled over the radio, telling everyone to start moving. I passed the message down the line, and we started walking again. Even in the middle of the day, it's always kinda dark under those damn Pasgate trees. We stopped around one for a quick lunch, then kept going. It had been a few hours when I noticed something was off. The forest had gone completely quiet. No more racket from the Ironsides. Before I could even wonder what was up, a voice came over the radio. All units halt. Ironsides has potential contact. Ready weapons. Over. Night crawlers read you, over, I said. Headless holding, over. The woods were dead silent except for the clicks of everyone chambering rounds. Even the birds and squirrels had shut up. "This is bad," I muttered to myself. The silence didn't last. A minute later, all hell broke loose up ahead. Gunfire, and lots of it. I immediately dropped behind a tree and peeked out towards the noise. Unlike us, the Ironsides carried full auto weapons and way more ammo. They were the heavy hitters, and you could tell. The shooting lasted for maybe a minute, then silence again. "Target is moving north towards the gray. Over," Captain Ford, the Ironsides leader, said over the radio. "Did you get a visual?" Over, Captain Hale of the Headless asked. "Barely. It's big, bipedal, looks humanoid, dark fur. Nothing more than that. It's fast as hell. Ironsides in pursuit. Both of you move your units up closer in case it doubles back." "Copy." "Over," I said. I radioed my team and told them to double time it. We took off at a jog, guns ready, packs feeling heavier with every step. It took 2 hours before we were in position to the left of the Ironsides, and the Headless guys got into place a few minutes after us. We stopped, and I radioed Captain Ford. "How's the tracking?" Over. "It's still heading north as far as we can tell. Too late to keep chasing it now. Let's get a line of fires going across the valley and make sure it stays north of us. Extra careful tonight, everyone." Over. I passed the word to my guys, and we built our fires extra big that night. I figured everyone would be as on edge as I was, but if they were, the guy I was camping with, a quiet fella named Silas, didn't show it. He fried up some dinner, and we ate in silence, ears straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. I slept first that night, rifle right next to me, knife clutched in my hand. Not that a knife does much good against the things we usually hunt, but it made me feel a little better. I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by this insane howl. Sounded like a person trying to imitate a dog, only way louder and more messed up. It was far away, but it pierced right through you. Silas was already crouched, rifle up, aiming out into the darkness. He motioned for me to stay quiet and still. I slowly, carefully picked up my rifle and scanned our little perimeter. A moment later, the forest lit up with a roar, a scream, and a burst of gunfire. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Adrenaline was pumping. This was it, the thrill, the reason I was a ranger. Silas and I stayed frozen, guns pointed towards the noise, listening to everything. After the initial chaos, all we could hear was something big crashing through the underbrush, getting further away. Then, about half an hour later, another one of those deep howls. One of our fires got hit. No Kai, one injured. Target still heading north. Over, Captain Ford barked over the radio, sounding out of breath. "Jet a good look at it." Over, I asked. "Injured ranger says 7 to 8 feet tall. Human-like, big teeth." Over. "Nothing else." Over. "He swears he emptied a clip into it. We should be able to follow the blood trail in the morning." Over. I read. Over. I set the radio down next to my blanket. Silas nodded at me slightly. "You got 2 more hours," he said, leaning back against a tree, rifle across his lap. I nodded and tried to go back to sleep. I had the last watch, so I sat there for 4 hours, staring out into the darkness, feeding the fire every now and then, just waiting for the sun to come up. I could see the other fires in the line, flickering through the trees like distant fireflies. For some reason, being out in the wilderness always makes me feel empty. Not in a bad way, though. It's more like all my emotions just flow in and then out again, like a stream, not leaving any trace. Was I scared? I don't know. Yeah, there's fear, sure, but it almost feels like it's not even mine. Like it's the fear of some ancient dude who lived and hunted in these woods centuries ago. An echo, you know. Like, it's there because I'm human, so fear is part of the package, but it's not my fear. Anyway, the lines started moving again right at sunrise. All three squads pushing forward, but slower than before. Captain Ford was right, the thing was bleeding. Not gushing, but enough to track it. It was moving fast towards the gray, and we reached the riverbank just before sunset. The gray, that's what divides Blackfeather Valley in half, more or less. It's a freezing cold river, well, more like a big stream, really, that comes tumbling down from the mountains. It cuts the Passgate Forest in the south from the Lake Wash Forest in the north. The Rangers have tried building bridges across the gray before, but every time we do, something smashes them to bits, and the guys sent to guard the bridges, they never come back. So we gave up on that a long time ago. Now we just wade across when we need to. Captain Ford, Captain Hale, and I met up at the center of the Ranger line for a pow. Whoa, before we went any further. We sat around a blazing fire, drinking the icy water from the gray out of our camp mugs. I'm saying dogman or werewolf, Ford said. Sounds about right, Hale shrugged. Your guy didn't get a good look. I asked Ford. Nah, but the description's close enough. Plus, that howling after the attack, that's enough for me, Ford replied. The night crawlers are good to go across, I assume. Hale asked me. Always, I nodded. The thing's wounded. I doubt it'll be that much trouble, Ford said confidently. I saw the blood trail. Looks pretty superficial to me. Still, we'll rest up and cross in the morning. Can you two split all the watches between yourselves? I asked, getting to my feet and holding my hands over the fire. The other two captains nodded. We move at dawn. I'll radio reports every hour, I said as I headed back to my squad. I filled them in, told them to get a good night's sleep and eat up. As I curled up on my blanket next to the fire, I watched through half-closed eyes as the Ironside and Headless sentries started patrolling up and down the south bank of the Gray. I fell into a restless sleep that night, dreaming of my arms and legs being ripped off by some giant, horrific beast. I woke up just before dawn, sweating like a pig. I splashed my face in the gray and got my gear ready, then went around and woke up the other night crawlers. All 12 of us gathered where the blood trail entered the gray. We checked our rifles, tightened our pack straps, and got ready to go. Captain Ford and Captain Hale wished us luck, and we splashed across the river, disappearing into the tree line of the lake wash. 3 of my guys, plus me, made up the main group. 2 guys, Noah and Finn, were our vanguard running ahead. Another 2, Liam and Mac, were the rear guard, in case this thing decided to follow us. And 2 pairs were way out on our flanks, Miles and Caleb on the left, and Mason and Ely on the right. We spent the whole day on this little game trail. The blood trail was starting to fade, but the beast's tracks were still easy to spot. Huge, long strides, and these massive paws with claws, something that walked on 2 legs sometimes and 4 legs other times. As the sun started going down, Noah and Finn radioed in. They said there was a ranger station not too far ahead, and we should be able to make it there just after sunset. We figured it'd be nice to sleep on bunks and under a roof for once, so we pushed on. They reported the station was fully stocked, and there were no signs of the beast. The 2 flanking pairs rejoined our main group, and the rearguard caught up too. So, 10 of us reached the station at the same time, about an hour after sunset. "Damn," said the guy next to me, a young ranger named Alex. "Yeah," I murmured. There, in front of us, were Noah and Finn. They were sprawled out on the ground in front of the station, in pools of their own blood. Guts and gore were everywhere. Finn was missing his head and one of his legs. They didn't even get a shot off or a radio call. Another ranger, a veteran named Cooper, said, his voice tight, "Secure the building. Nobody goes outside until sunrise. 2 guards on duty at all times. Figure out the shifts yourselves," I said, turning to the guys behind me. "We'll bury them in the morning." We filed inside. The station was untouched. It was a long log cabin, full of bunks and supplies, with a ladder leading up to an observation tower. We'd built a bunch of these stations all over the lake wash and the pass gate. They weren't permanently manned, just places for us to resupply and rest for a night when we were out ranging. Nobody said a word that night. The only sounds in the station were guys tossing and turning in their bunks, or the occasional snore. We got up at dawn, buried Noah and Finn, and radioed the report back across the river. We searched the camp in the daylight, but we could only find one set of the beast's tracks, still heading north. The tracks were caked with dried blood. How did one of these things, wounded, get the drop on 2 rangers? Alex asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. "I don't know," I replied. "But nobody separates from the main group now. We all stick together. Be ready to shoot, anytime." We took off our hats and saluted the 2 fresh graves, then started heading north again, following the beast's tracks. A knot of unease was growing in my stomach as the day wore on. The forest was still and silent. Still no sign of the beast, except for the trail we were following. We reached Blackwater Lake at nightfall, the lake wash is named after, and camped on its quiet shore. I could sense the guys were getting more and more nervous the further we got from the gray, but nobody dared complain. When we woke up the next morning, there were 9 of us left. One of the sentries, a guy named Ethan, had vanished during the night. There were a few footprints at the edge of the camp, but they led straight into Blackwater Lake and didn't come out. "Old lady of the lake got him," Cooper said, his voice flat, over breakfast. Nobody said anything back. We just kept eating. We packed up and moved on, shooting a few nervous glances at the glassy, still surface of Blackwater Lake. We kept following the trail north. About halfway through the day, we broke out of the northern tree line of the lake wash and were on the north slopes of the valley. The trail kept going, and it only took us another hour to find what we were looking for. "Well, he made it pretty damn easy for us to find him," said Alex from behind me. We were all staring at a gaping cave mouth in the side of the hill. You could feel the hot air coming out of it. Blood and bones were scattered all around the entrance, and the ground was covered in this layer of powdered bone, like some kind of messed up welcome mat. "All right, who's going in first?" I asked, and the guys behind me chuckled nervously. "Screw capturing that thing. There were explosives back at the station. I say we level the whole cave," Cooper said, and everyone else muttered their agreement. "For once, I agree with you all. I don't think we're capturing this thing." I shrugged. And Miles will go back for the explosives. The rest of you stay here and make sure it doesn't leave the cave." The guys shifted uneasily, looking at each other. Nobody was thrilled about staying behind. "There are 7 of you and 1 of it, and you know exactly where it is. Don't worry about it. It's like shooting fish in a barrel at this point," I said, trying to reassure them. I reshouldered my pack and motioned for Miles to follow me. "Double time. We should be back in a day." Miles and I took off, following our own trail back towards the station. We were back in the lake wash again, a few hours from the cave, when my blood turned to ice. I heard it shouting, shooting, and howling, all coming from far away, back where we'd left the others. Miles looked at me, and our eyes met. I stopped dead and raised my radio. "This is Jake. Does anyone read me? Status report. Over, ba." The radio crackled to life, a jumble of screaming, hissing static, and gunshots. The guy on the other end, it sounded like Alex, was yelling something I couldn't make out, except for one word. The one word I didn't want to hear. "Pack." Then the line went dead. I tried 2 more times to reach them, but nothing. Miles was staring at me, his face pale, gripping and re-gripping his rifle. "What do we do?" he asked. I stopped and thought for a minute, looking back the way we'd come, then back down the trail. Same orders. We get the explosives and we bury them. I told Miles to dump any extra weight from his pack, and I did the same, throwing out anything I didn't think we'd need. We took off at a jog, heading back down the trail, grateful for the lighter packs. We ran until it was well past sunset, legs burning, stomachs growling. "Can you keep going without sleeping?" I asked Miles, as I wolfed down some water and canned meat. "For a few hours at least," he replied. I nodded, and we picked up our rifles and started running again. It was close to 3 in the morning when we finally stopped, and only because the trail was getting too dangerous to run in the dark. We'd passed Blackwater, and I figured we'd reach the station by noon the next day, as long as we didn't sleep too long. 2 hours. "I'll take first watch," I said, catching my breath and pointing at the ground behind Miles. He didn't need to be told twice. He dropped to the ground and was out like a light. I struggled to stay awake, pacing around the small clearing we were in, chain smoking the few cigarettes I had left. I nudged Miles awake after 2 hours, and I lay down, falling asleep instantly. I woke up to the feeling of sun on my face. "That's not good," I thought, bolting upright. Miles had fallen asleep, too, leaning against a tree. We'd slept way longer than we should have. I got up and splashed some water in Miles' face, waking him up with a start. "Get up," I yelled. He jumped to his feet, lifting his gun. He didn't say anything, but I could see the fear on his face. He knew he'd messed up. We started running again, but after 15 minutes, we heard a howl echo from the forest behind us. Way too close. The fear is not mine. The fear is not mine, I repeated to myself over and over as we ran. The howls were getting closer and more frequent. By noon, I figured we were almost back to the station. That's when the howling erupted from right nearby. I stopped, turned, and cocked my rifle. "What are you doing?" Miles yelled, spinning around to look at me. "They're too close and too fast. We won't outrun them," I said, breathing hard, raising my rifle to point into the woods. Miles stopped, looked at me for a second, then seemed to get it. He readied his own rifle. A light mist was clinging to the floor of the lake wash, and the forest was dead silent as we stood there, side by side. Guns trained on the trail we'd just come from. All we could hear was our own ragged breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone quiet, the silence was shattered. A howling, snarling creature came sprinting out of the underbrush. It was huge, 8 feet tall, easy, even hunched over like it was, rippling with muscle. It had a head like some kind of messed up, rabid dog, and these red eyes that just screamed hunger. Way too many teeth, and its tongue was lolling out, all yellow and red and black with fat and blood and marrow. Miles got a shot off, hitting the thing in the shoulder. It staggered, but it didn't slow it down much. It was moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It leaped the last 20 feet and landed right on top of Miles, sending him sprawling. It snarled at me, ready to pounce, but then it snapped its head back towards Miles when he plunged a knife into its side. That was all the time I needed. I raised my rifle and put a bullet right through the thing's head. It froze, tottered for a second, then collapsed on the ground next to Miles. I helped him to his feet, but he was in bad shape. The beast's claws had raked him all along his side, and the impact had clearly broken some of his ribs. I slung his rifle over my shoulder and draped his arm over mine, and we started staggering back towards the station. "Nice shot," Miles mumbled, weakly, trying to wipe the blood off his face. "Thanks." We listened, and we could still hear howling, but it sounded further away again. I hoped this one had been a lone hunter, and we'd have enough time to reach the station. We did. It took almost another 2 hours, stumbling along, but we finally made it to the station. I'd radioed back to the other ranger units on the Gray a few hours ago, told them our situation was FU bar. The Ironsides and Headless Men were on their way north, full force, to help us. They said they'd meet us at the ranger station, but I knew that would take the better part of a day. Miles died. His breathing got all rapid and shallow, and I'm guessing he drowned on his own blood from the amount he eventually coughed up. Didn't have time to bury him. I found the explosives. The pack, it's real close now. I'm thinking they'll be here any minute. If I'm lucky. But I have the explosives. They won't know what hit them. For the first time in my life, though, I don't think the fear is primal or instinctual or whatever. I think the fear is mine. I've always hated the smell of gun oil. It sticks to everything. Your clothes, your backpack, even the hair on the back of your hands. It just soaks right in. But here I am on my knees in our crappy mudroom, a Remington, 308 across my lap, and that damned smell is all up in my face. The sun's barely up, just kinda scratching at the blinds, all gray and gross like a dead fish. My old man Jerry is in the kitchen, banging around with the coffee pot and grumbling. We're heading up north today, into the Michigan woods. Same as every year before Sarah, before we lost her. Those old scars start throbbing, right on cue, as I load bullets into the magazine. It's been 10 years since that goddamn hunting trip. The one that ripped my family into, before, and after. Before, Sarah's laugh was like the background music to our lives. After, every silence was just her not being there. We were just kids. I was 10, Sarah was 8. It was supposed to be one of those bonding trips Dad was always going on about. But shit went sideways. We got separated from Jerry somehow. One minute we were following him, the next we were lost, swallowed up by the woods. Jerry says when he found me, I was curled up under a fallen tree, eyes wide, frozen stiff. All I could get out, with my teeth chattering like crazy, was Dogman. Later, after the search parties had gone over every inch of those woods, they found her. What was left of Sarah anyway? It was obvious she'd been mauled. Bad. The cops said it was probably a beer, but Jerry, he never bought that. He'd seen the tracks, too big and weird for any beer he knew. As I load another bullet, the memory hits me. Bam. Big hairy hands reaching out, all claws and messed up. But the rest of the thing, it's like a shadow in my head. I can't see it. All I got are those messed up pieces and the sound of Sarah screaming. My brain blocked most of it out, I guess. Self-defense or something. For years, sleep was a freaking war zone. I'd wake up in weird places. The kitchen floor, the backyard, even down by the creek once. My therapist said it was my brain trying to work it out, to go back into those woods and find Sarah. But all I found in those sleepless nights was more emptiness. It took time, a lot of it, and therapy I didn't think I needed. But the sleepwalking did eventually stop. I guess I started to find some kind of peace. I've mostly moved on. Those messed up memories are still there, hiding in the dark corners of my mind, but they don't run the show anymore. I just finished my second year at Michigan State, studying environmental science. Jerry, though, losing Sarah broke him. He became a ghost. And it killed his marriage to Mom. He blamed himself for not keeping us close, for not protecting Sarah. His whole life turned into this one thing, finding whatever killed her. He read every book, every article on weird creatures and unexplained stuff. He mapped sightings, connected dots on blurry photos and shaky stories about the Dogman. But now, with the 10th anniversary of Sarah's death coming up, Jerry's obsession is like on steroids. He's up all night, staring at his maps and notes, muttering about patterns and cycles. He's sure the Dogman shows up every 10 years, and this is our chance to finally hunt the damn thing down. Me, I'm not so sure. The whole Dogman thing seems like a way for Jerry to deal with his guilt and grief. Turn it into something he can fight. But I decided to come along on this trip. Part of it's to keep an eye on him, but another part I don't know. Maybe we'll find something out there. Closure, maybe. I finish loading the rifle and set it aside, standing up to stretch. I wipe my greasy hands on a rag, trying to get rid of that smell. The light's starting to fill the room now, making long shadows on the floor. Jerry comes out with 2 thermoses of coffee. His eyes are all tired and bloodshot. "You ready, Alex?" he asks, handing me a thermos. His voice is rough, like he hasn't slept in days. "Yeah, I'm ready," I say, trying to sound more sure than I feel. We load our gear into the truck, and it's like the weight of it is the weight we're carrying inside. The drive from Lansing is long and quiet, the silence full of unspoken stuff. Memories, regrets, you name it. The drive north is just a blur of highway and the drone of the engine. I doze off, and the landscape outside turns into a haze. In my sleep, pieces of that day with Sarah play like a broken record. I see her smile, the way she tugged on my sleeve, all excited to explore. Sunlight comes through the trees in sharp, jagged streaks. Then it gets dark, all messed up. Sarah's voice echoes, her laugh turning into a scream. I hear leaves crunching under something heavy moving around us. I see a shadow huge and looming, not like any animal I know. Then something darker creeps in, something I've never let myself remember clearly. Before I can see what it is, I jolt awake as the truck hits a rough patch. Jerry glances over. "Bad dream?" he asks. I nod, rubbing my eyes, the dream still clinging to me like the cold. "Yeah, just thinking about Sarah," I manage to say. As we drive, Jerry tries to fill the silence with small talk. He asks about my finals, my plans for the summer. Anything to keep the conversation going. He sounds forced, like he's trying too hard to be cheerful. It's obvious his heart isn't in it. I answer when I have to, keeping it short, my eyes on the passing scenery. The landscape changes as we go further north, from flat and boring to rolling hills with thick patches of forest. It's pretty country, the kind that reminds you how huge and wild Michigan can be. But today it just feels like it's closing in on us. We finally get to the cabin. It's tucked way back in the woods, all old and weathered, like it's part of the trees. The place hasn't changed much, from another time, full of our past. I can still see Sarah running around the porch, her laughter ringing out. Jerry parks the truck, and we get out, the air sharp and cold. It smells like pine and wet dirt. We start unloading, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "Let's get this inside," Jerry says, his voice gruff as he hefts a duffel bag onto his shoulder. I nod, grab my own bag, and follow him to the cabin. Inside, it's a mix of old and new. The same beat-up furniture, but with new hunting gear and maps all over the table. Jerry's obsession is everywhere, a constant reminder of why we're here. As we unpack, we try to act normal. He talks about the latest cryptid sightings he's read about, his eyes lighting up in a way that both worries and saddens me. "Did you hear about the sighting up near Alpana?" he asks, spreading out his maps. "Yeah, you mentioned it," I reply, trying to sound interested. "Do you really think there's something to it?" Jerry's eyes meet mine, and for a second, I see doubt. But it's gone fast, replaced by that grim determination. "I have to believe it, Alex. It's the only thing that makes sense." We finish unpacking, the silence between us getting heavier. I step outside to clear my head, the cool air a relief. The sun's starting to set, making long shadows across the clearing. I can't shake this feeling of unease. "You can take the upstairs room," Jerry mutters. His voice is strained, trying to sound normal, but it's clear he's carrying a ton of bricks. I nod, hauling my backpack up the creaky stairs to the small bedroom that I used to share with Sarah. The room feels smaller now, or maybe I've just grown too much. I unpack silently, setting my things aside. The bed is stiff and cold. As I settle in, I can't help but glance at the corner where Sarah and I would huddle together, whispering secrets and making plans for adventures that would never happen. I push the thoughts away, focusing on unpacking. After settling in, I go back downstairs to find Jerry loading up a backpack with supplies for our hunt. The intensity in his eyes is obvious, his hands moving with practiced precision. I know this routine. It's one he's done a million times on his solo trips since that day. "We'll head out early," he says, not looking up. "Gotta make the most of the daylight." I nod, unease curling in my stomach. I'm not just worried about what we might find, or not find, out there. I'm worried about him. Each year, the obsession seems to eat away at him a bit more, leaving less of the dad I knew. The morning air is sharp enough to cut you, full of that pine smell and wet earth. We head deeper into the woods, and yeah, it's rugged and all that, but the tension between me and Jerry, that's what makes it feel off. Jerry's moving like a man on a mission, his eyes scanning the woods like he's expecting something to jump out. Every little snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves has him on edge, and it's putting me on edge too. As we walk, my mind wanders back to that day 10 years ago. I can almost hear Sarah's voice, high and clear, calling out as she ran ahead, "Catch me, Alex." I remember the sunlight filtering through the leaves, making those dancing shadows on the ground. Those memories are so damn vivid, it feels like I could just turn a corner and see her there, waiting for us. Jerry stops suddenly and kneels, looking at the ground. He points out some tracks that are way too big for a deer, with a weird gait. "It's been here, Al. I'm telling you, it's close," he whispers, a mix of excitement and something darker in his voice. I nod, but I'm not sure what to believe. Part of me wants to write it all off as grief making him crazy, but another part, the part that heard Sarah scream and saw something huge in the woods that day, isn't so sure. As we keep going, Jerry's comments get more out there. "You know, they say the dogman moves in cycles, drawn to certain places, certain times, like it's tied to the land itself," he says, more to himself than to me. He's always been hung up on this creature, but now it's like he's gone full on fanatic. We set up a makeshift blind near a clearing where Jerry insists the creature will pass. Hours crawl by. Nothing but the occasional bird or a deer way off in the distance. The sun gets higher, casting these long, thin shadows through the trees. I shift around, trying to get comfortable, but the forest floor is hard as a rock. My eyes dart between the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, to break the monotony. Jerry, though, he's like a statue, his gaze fixed on the tree line like he can make the dogman appear just by staring hard enough. A bird chirps nearby, making me jump. I sigh and adjust my grip on the rifle. I glance over at Jerry. "Anything?" I ask, more out of boredom than anything else. Not yet, he says, his voice tight. But it's out there, I know it. I nod, even though I'm not so sure. The forest seems too quiet, too still. Maybe we're just chasing ghosts. As the sun starts to go down, the forest gets all bathed in this warm, golden light. The air cools, and a breeze rustles the leaves. I shiver, but it's not just from the cold. The long hours of sitting and waiting are starting to wear me down. Let's call it a day for now, Jerry finally says, his voice heavy with disappointment. We'll head back to the cabin, get some rest, and try again tomorrow. I stand up and stretch, feeling stiff all over. We pack up our gear in silence and start the long walk back to the cabin. The only sounds are the crunch of leaves under our feet and the birds settling in for the night. Dinner is quiet, both of us lost in our own heads. I try to make small talk, asking Jerry about his plans for tomorrow, but it feels forced. We clean up in silence. After dinner, I go up to the bedroom. I'm beat, but sleep feels miles away. I lie down, staring at the ceiling. The room's dark except for a bit of moonlight coming through the window. Downstairs, I hear Jerry moving around, probably not able to sleep either. I drift off, but it's not peaceful. My dreams pull me back to that day in the woods. Sarah's voice is clear and vibrant, her laughter echoing through the trees. She looks just like she did then, bright-eyed and full of life, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she runs ahead. "Come on, Alex. You can't catch me," she teases, her voice playful. I chase after her, but then the dream shifts. The sky darkens, the woods around us get thick and scary. Sarah's laughter fades, replaced by this heavy silence. I see her ahead, standing still, her back to me. "Sarah," I call out, my voice shaky. She turns slowly, her eyes wide and scared. "Alex, you have to remember," she says, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't what you think. You need to know the truth." Sarah's words hang in the air, all cryptic and unsettling. Before I can say anything, she turns and starts running again, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Panic floods me, and I sprint after her, my feet pounding the ground. "Sarah, wait," I shout, but it's no use. The forest seems to close in, the trees all tall and twisted, shadows dancing like they're alive. I push forward, trying to keep her in sight, but she's too fast, slipping away like smoke. Suddenly, there's a rustle, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Sarah screams, a sound that cuts right through me. It happens so fast, I can't see what it is, just a dark blur that snatches her up. "Sarah," I scream, my voice cracking. I stumble, falling to my knees as the forest spins around me. My heart's racing, and the terror is so real, so intense, it yanks me back to that awful day. The one that changed everything. I jolt awake, gasping for air. I sit up, wiping sweat off my forehead, trying to calm down. The room is still dark, the shadows from the moonlight flickering on the walls. My heart is still pounding from the nightmare, the echo of Sarah's scream ringing in my ears. As I'm trying to get a grip, the floorboards outside my room creak. The door opens slowly, and there's Jerry standing in the doorway with a huge Bowie knife in his hand, looking tense as hell. "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" I whisper, my voice shaking. "Shh," he hisses, holding up a hand. I heard something. Something moving around in the cabin. Stay quiet. I swallow hard, my mouth dry. I glance at the clock. It's just past 3 in the morning. The cabin is silent, the kind of deep silence that makes every little sound seem louder. I can't hear anything weird, but Jerry's face is dead serious. He motions for me to get up, and I do, moving as quietly as I can. My heart's racing, a mix of the leftover fear from the dream and the sudden, sharp anxiety of now. Jerry leads the way, stepping carefully out of the bedroom and into the hallway, the knife held out in front of him like he's ready to fight. We creep through the cabin, checking each room. The living room is empty, the furniture casting long shadows in the dim moonlight. The kitchen is just as we left it, the plates from dinner still drying on the counter. Everything seems normal, untouched. We finish our sweep, and there's nothing. The silence is heavy, broken only by our soft footsteps. I can see the tension in Jerry's body, his grip on the knife like a lifeline. After checking the last room, we stop in the hallway, the air thick with unspoken questions. "There's nothing here," I say, keeping my voice low. "Are you sure you heard something?" He looks at me, his eyes searching. I heard growling, deep and close. It was right outside the window. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, I suggest, but the certainty in his voice makes me doubt my own words. No, it wasn't like that. It was different. He insists, his voice tight. I nod, not wanting to argue, but I'm starting to get seriously worried. The look in his eyes sends a chill down my spine. It's not just fear, it's desperation. The kind that comes from years of chasing shadows and finding nothing. I can see how this hunt has worn him down, turned him into someone I barely know. We head back to our rooms. As I lie down, my mind's racing. I can't help but wonder if Jerry's losing it, if the grief and guilt have finally pushed him over the edge. Jerry wasn't always like this. Before Sarah died, he was the kind of dad who took us fishing, helped with homework, and told bad jokes that made us laugh and groan at the same time. He was solid, dependable. But losing Sarah changed him. The guilt twisted him into someone else, someone driven by a need for answers that might never come. I try to sleep, but my thoughts keep me awake. I can hear Jerry moving around downstairs, probably pacing or checking the locks again. His paranoia has become a constant thing, and I don't know how to help him. I don't even know if I can help him. The next morning, the sunlight is weak, doing nothing to lift the heavy mood in the cabin. I drag myself out of bed, feeling like I haven't slept at all. Jerry's already up, hunched over his maps at the kitchen table, his eyes bloodshot. "Morning," I mumble, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes as I pour myself some coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" He shakes his head, not looking up from his notes. "Not much. Couldn't stop thinking about what I heard last night." I sip my coffee, trying to shake off the nightmare. "Maybe it was just an animal, Dad. We're in the middle of nowhere, after all." He finally looks up, his eyes intense. "Ilex, I know what I heard. It wasn't just an animal, it was something else." I sigh, not wanting to get into it. "Okay, fine, Dad. What's the plan for today?" "We're going back out. I found some tracks yesterday, and I want to follow them. See where they lead." I nod. feeling a mix of apprehension and resignation. I can see how much this means to him, how desperate he is for any kind of lead. All right, let's get packed and head out. We spend the morning getting ready, loading up our gear and double-checking everything. Jerry is meticulous, going over every detail like it's life or death. I try to match his focus, but my mind keeps drifting back to Sarah and the dream. Her words echo in my head. You need to know the truth. We set off into the woods, the air crisp and cool. The forest is alive with sounds. Birds, rustling leaves. But it all feels distant, like background noise to the tension between us. Jerry leads the way, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of those tracks. As we walk, I can't help but notice how jumpy he is. He mutters to himself, his eyes darting around like he's expecting something to jump out at any second. His grip on his rifle is tight, his knuckles white. "Dad, are you okay?" I ask, trying to keep my voice steady. He glances at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine, just focused." He stops a lot to examine the ground or the bark of trees, pointing out marks and signs that mean nothing to me. "Look at this," he says, crouching down to look at a broken branch. "See how it's snapped. That's not a deer or a bear. That's something bigger, stronger." I crouch next to him, squinting at the branch. To me, it just looks like a regular broken branch, the kind you see all over the forest. "I don't know, Dad. It just looks like a branch to me," I say, trying to keep my voice neutral. Jerry's eyes flicker with frustration. "You're not looking close enough. It's the way it's snapped. Too clean, too deliberate. Something did this." I nod, not wanting to argue. "Okay, sure. But even if you're right, it could be anything. A storm, another hunter." His expression hardens. "I know what I'm looking for. This is different." I sigh, feeling the weight of the past and the tension between us pressing down. "Dad, I had a dream last night. About Sarah." The words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken stuff. Jerry's eyes widen and he straightens up, his whole demeanor changing. "What kind of dream? What did you see?" His voice is urgent, almost desperate. "It was weird. We were in the woods like now, but everything felt different. Sarah was there, running ahead, laughing. Then she stopped and told me I needed to know the truth, that it wasn't what I thought." Jerry grabs my shoulders, his grip tight. "What else did she say? Did she tell you anything specific? Anything about the creature?" I shake my head, feeling a chill. "No, that was it. She just said I needed to know the truth, and then she was gone." Jerry's grip tightens, his eyes boring into mine with a mix of desperation and hope. "Alex, you have to try to remember. Think hard. What did the creature look like? Did you see anything else?" I pull back a little, uneasy with how intense he's being. "Dad, I told you. I don't remember. It was just a dream. A nightmare, really. My mind's probably just mixing things up." He lets go and runs a hand through his hair, looking frustrated and lost. "Dreams can be important. They can hold memories we've buried. Please try to remember. This could be a sign, a clue." I rub my temples, feeling a headache coming on. "I've tried, okay? I've tried for years to piece together what happened. But it's all just fragments, like a puzzle that doesn't fit. The dream, it felt real, but I don't think it's telling me anything new." Jerry's face falls. and he looks older than I've ever seen him. He turns away, staring into the forest like it holds all the answers. Yuroli Tentian Drochin Trachoshalujin Chaujun Twilder. As we head back to the cabin, the sun starts to set, casting long shadows. The air gets colder, and I pull my jacket tighter. Jerry is silent, lost in his thoughts, his face drawn and haggard. Back at the cabin, we unload our gear in silence. Jerry disappears into his room, muttering about going over his notes. I decide to explore the cabin, hoping to find something that might help me understand what's going on with him. In the attic, I find a box of old family photos and papers. As I sift through it, I find a worn journal with Jerry's handwriting on the cover. Curiosity gets the better of me, and I open it, flipping through the pages. The journal is full of notes and sketches about the dogman. But there's other stuff too. Entries about Sarah, about that day in the woods. His handwriting gets more erratic, harder to read. One entry stands out, dated a few days after Sarah's death. June 15, 2013. It was supposed to be a normal trip. Keep them close, Jerry, I kept telling myself. But I failed. Sarah is gone, and it's my fault. I heard her scream, saw the shadows. I tried to get to her, but it was there. Too fast. Too strong. My hands blood everywhere. No one will believe me. I can't even believe myself. I have to find it. I have to protect Alex. I have to make it right. God, what have I done? Before I can read more, the attic door creaks open, and Jerry's voice cuts through the silence. What are you doing up here? His tone is sharp, almost panicked. I turn to see him in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between anger and fear. I clutch the journal to my chest, my mind racing. I found this, I was just trying to understand. In an instant, he crosses the room and snatches the journal from my hands. His grip is tight, his knuckles white. You had no right, he growls, his voice trembling. Dad, I just wanted to know the truth. I shout, frustration boiling over. What really happened to Sarah? His eyes flash with rage and anguish, and before I can react, he slaps me across the face. The force of it knocks me off balance, and I stumble backward, my cheek stinging. For a moment there's stunned silence. We both stand there, breathing hard, the air thick with tension. I'm sorry, Jerry says finally, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to, He trails off, clutching the journal like a lifeline. I touch my cheek, feeling the heat from the slap, and take a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Dad, what aren't you telling me? What really happened that day? Stay out of it, Alex. Jerry growls, his eyes dark with anger. You don't know what you're messing with. He turns and storms out of the attic. I'm left standing there, my cheek throbbing, my mind racing. What the fuck is going on? What really happened to Sarah? And what is Jerry so afraid of? That night, I sleep with my rifle within arm's reach, more afraid of my dad than any dogman. The slap still burns on my cheek, and the look in his eyes, rage, fear, something darker, haunts me. I lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin, every sound amplified in the stillness. Eventually, exhaustion pulls me under, and I fall into a restless sleep. The dream returns, vivid and unsettling. I'm back in the woods, chasing after Sarah. Her laughter echoes through the trees, a haunting reminder of happier times. This time, though, I push myself harder, refusing to let her slip away. Alex, catch my. She calls, her voice playful. I'm coming, Sarah. I shout, my legs pumping, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest around us is a twisted, shadowy maze, the trees seeming to close in. Sarah's figure becomes clearer, her blonde hair catching the dim light filtering through the canopy. She stops suddenly, turning to face me, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah, what is it? I ask, my voice trembling. Look behind you, she whispers, her voice barely audible. I turn slowly, dread creeping up my spine. In the shadows, I see a figure, its form indistinct and shifting. It's not quite animal, not quite human, something in between. The sight of it sends a jolt of terror through me, and I wake up with a start, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I'm not in my bed. The ground beneath me is cold and hard, the smell of damp earth filling my nostrils. Panic rises as I realize I've sleepwalked into the woods. I scramble to my feet, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The moon casts a pale glow over the surroundings, revealing what looks like a long, abandoned animal lair. The walls are covered in giant claw marks, deep gouges in the wood and earth. The air is heavy with the scent of decay, and a chill runs through me. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Carefully, I start to move, my eyes scanning the ground, desperate for a familiar landmark. That's when I see them. Faded scraps of fabric caught on the jagged edges of the underbrush. My steps falter, a sense of dread washing over me as I bend down to examine them. The fabric is torn, weathered by time and the elements, but unmistakably familiar. It's part of Sarah's jacket, the bright pink one she wore on the day she disappeared. As I strain to make sense of it all, a rustling sound behind me snaps my focus. My heart leaps into my throat. I spin around, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I don't have. Because, of course, I didn't bring it in my unconscious state. The shadowy figure that emerges from the trees is unsettlingly familiar, mirroring the menacing forms of my nightmares. But as it steps into the moonlight, I recognize the worn jacket, the weary posture. It's Jerry. Alex. He calls out, his voice a mix of relief and stern concern. I've been looking everywhere for you. What the hell are you doing out here? I exhale slowly, the terror ebbing away as reality sets back in. I don't know, Dad. I must have sleepwalked again. My voice is shaky, my earlier dream still clinging to the edges of my consciousness. Jerry stares at me in disbelief. You haven't sleepwalked since you were a kid, Al. This isn't just a coincidence. His eyes dart around, taking in the surroundings. The eerie, claw-marked den, the unsettling quiet of the woods. How did you even find this place? I shake my head, struggling to find an answer. I don't know, Dad. I woke up here. The uncertainty in my voice does nothing to ease the tension. His eyes lock onto the tattered remains of Sarah's jacket in my hands, and something inside him snaps. The color drains from his face as he stumbles a few steps backward. This is where it happened, he murmurs, his voice barely a whisper. This is where we found Sarah. I thought you said you don't remember anything from that night. He says accusingly. I swear, Dad, I don't know anything about this place. I insist, my own heart pounding. It was you, wasn't it? You've been hiding this from me. His voice is frantic. You, last night, the growling, it was you. His voice rises, tinged with hysteria. I step back, my pulse racing, feeling the chill of the night and the weight of his accusation. Dad, I don't know what you're talking ab. No, he interrupts, his voice breaking as he points a trembling finger at me. You knew, you always knew. It was you, Alex. All these years, the evidence was right there, but I refused to see it. You were the dogman. You killed Sarah. His words hit me like a physical blow, absurd and horrifying in their implications. Dad, you're not making any sense. You're talking crazy. I was just a little kid. How could I? I protest, my voice shaky. He steps closer, his presence looming over me, the outline of his figure distorted by the shadows of the trees. Think about it. It all makes sense now. You led us here to this place because you remember. Because you did it. Dayad. Stop it. I shout, my heart pounding in my chest. You are scaring me. You need help, professional help. This isn't you. But he's beyond reason, his eyes wild with a haunted grief. I have to end this. He mutters, more to himself than to me, his hand tightening around his rifle. His finger hovers dangerously over the trigger of his rifle. My instincts kick in, and I know I have to act fast. I lunge toward him, trying to knock the weapon away, but he's quicker than I expected. We struggle, our breaths heavy in the cold night air, the sounds of our scuffle the only noise in the otherwise silent woods. His strength surprises me, fueled by his frantic emotions. He shoves me back, and I stumble over a root, my balance lost for a crucial second. That's all he needs. He raises his rifle, his intentions clear in his wild, pained eyes. I dive to the ground just as the shot rings out, a deafening blast that echoes ominously through the trees. The bullet whizzes past, narrowly missing me, embedding itself in the bark of an old pine. I scramble to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears, and I start running. The underbrush claws at my clothes and skin, but I push through, driven by a primal urge to survive. Dad, stop. It's me, Alex. I shout back as I dodge between the trees. Another shout breaks the silence, closer this time, sending splinters of wood flying from a nearby tree trunk. It's surreal, being hunted by my own father, a man tormented by grief and lost in his delusions. I don't stop to look back. I can hear him crashing through the forest behind me, his heavy breaths and muttered curses carried on the wind. The terrain is rough, and I'm fueled by adrenaline, but exhaustion is setting in. I need a plan. Ahead, I see a rocky outcrop and make a split-second decision to head for it. It offers a chance to hide, to catch my breath and maybe reason with him if he catches up. As I reach the rocks, I slip behind the largest one, my body pressed tight against the cold, damp surface. I hear his footsteps approaching, slow and cautious now. As I press against the rock, trying to calm my racing heart, I can hear Dad's footsteps drawing closer, each step crunching ominously on the forest floor. He's methodical, deliberate, like a hunter stalking his prey. Come out, Alex. Dad's voice is ragged, filled with a blend of fury and pain. My heart pounds against my chest, the cold sweat on my back making me shiver against the rough surface of the rock. I know I can't just sit here. It's only a matter of time before he finds me. Taking a deep breath, I peek around the edge of the rock, trying to gauge his position. I see him, rifle raised, scanning the area slowly. This might be my only chance to end this madness without further violence. I need to disarm him, to talk some sense into him if I can. As quietly as I can, I move out from behind the rock, my steps careful to avoid any twigs or leaves that might betray my position. I am almost upon him when a branch snaps under my foot, a sound so trivial yet so alarmingly loud in the quiet of the woods. Dad whirls around, looking completely unhinged. "Alex," he exclaims, his rifle swinging in my direction. Panic overtakes me, and I lunge forward, my hands reaching for the gun. We struggle, the rifle between us, our breaths heavy and erratic. "Dad, please stop," I pled, trying to wrestle the gun away. But he's strong, stronger than I expected. In the chaos, the rifle goes off. The sound is deafening, a sharp echo that seems to reverberate off every tree around us. Pain explodes in my abdomen, sharp and burning, like nothing I've ever felt before. I stagger back, my hands instinctively going to the wound. The warmth of my own blood coats my fingers, stark and terrifying. Dad drops the rifle, his eyes wide with horror. "Oh my God, what have I done?" he gasps, rushing to my side as I collapse onto the forest floor. As the pain sears through me, a strange, overpowering energy surges within. It's wild, primal, unlike anything I've ever experienced. Looking down in horror, my hands are no longer hands but large, hairy, clawed appendages. The transformation is rapid, consuming. My vision blurs, senses heighten, and a raw, guttural growl builds in my throat. In that moment, a flood of understanding washes over me, mingling with the horror of realization. These are the hands of the creature from my nightmares, the creature whose face I can never fully recall because, as I now understand, it is me. What happens next feels detached, as if I'm no longer in control of my own actions, watching from a distance as my body moves on its own. I turn towards my dad, his face a mask of terror. He stumbles back, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of what his son has become. The forest around us seems to fall silent, holding its breath as the nightmarish scene unfolds. I can hear my own growls, guttural and deep, filling the air with a sound that's both foreign and intimately familiar. The pain in my abdomen fuels a dark, violent urge, an urge that's too strong to resist. With a ferocity that feels both alien and intrinsic, I move towards him. My dad, paralyzed by fear and shock, doesn't run. Maybe he can't. Maybe he doesn't want to. The encounter is brutal and swift, a blur of motion and violence. My dad barely puts up a struggle, as though resigned to his fate. Not that there is anything he can do. The creature that I've become is too powerful, too consumed by the wild instincts surging through me. I tear him apart, limb from bloody limb, my hands. No, my claws, rending through fabric and flesh with disgusting ease. The sound of my dad's screams, of tearing fabric and flesh, is drowned out by the animalistic growls that echo through the trees. When it's all over, the red mist that had clouded my vision begins to fade, and the fierce, uncontrollable rage that drove my actions subsides. I'm left standing, my breaths heavy and erratic, in the eerie stillness of the forest. The transformation reverses as quickly as it came on, and I find myself back in my human form. My clothes are ripped to shreds, hanging off my frame in tattered remnants. At my feet lies what's left of my dad, his body torn and unrecognizable. I glance down at my abdomen, expecting agony, but instead find my wound miraculously healed. No sign of the gunshot remains, just a faint scar where I expected a bloody mess. Shock sets in, a numbing disbelief mixed with a gut-wrenching realization of what I've become and what I've done. My hands, now human again, tremble as I look at them, half expecting to see the claws that had so effortlessly ripped through flesh and bone. But there's only blood, my father's blood against my skin. I stand there for what feels like an eternity, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Eventually, the shock wears thin, and a cold practicality takes hold. I need to get out of here. I need to cover my tracks to disappear. Because who would believe this? Who would understand that I didn't choose this? That I'm not a monster by choice? With trembling hands, I do what's necessary. I bury my dad in a shallow grave, the physical act of digging strangely grounding. I cover him with leaves and branches, a pitiful attempt to hide the brutality of his end. I take a moment, whispering apologies into the wind, knowing full well that nothing I say can change what happened. I leave the forest behind, my mind a whirl of dark thoughts. As I walk, the first hints of dawn brush against the horizon, the sky bleeding a soft pink. It's hauntingly beautiful. I make my way back to civilization, to the life I once knew, but everything is different now. I'm a fugitive, not just from the law, but from myself. The creature within me is a terrifying reality, a part of me that I can no longer deny. The years that follow are a blur of running and hiding, of trying to outpace the darkness that lurks within. I take on odd jobs, always moving, never staying in one place for too long. The fear of discovery is a constant companion, a shadow that stretches long and menacing over every aspect of my life. But amidst the fear and the running, there's also a strange sense of acceptance that begins to grow. I start to understand that the creature, the dogman, is not just a monster that killed Sarah and my father. It's a part of me, a dark and primal force that's intertwined with my very being. I'll never be able to escape what happened in those woods, the truth of that night. But maybe, just maybe, I can learn to live with it, to control the beast within, to keep it caged. The journey is far from over, and the road ahead is uncertain. But as I walk on, under the vast and indifferent sky, I know one thing for sure: I am Alex, and I am the dogman. And this is my story.